Hans. Chapter 1. Hans starts on his travels. Once upon a time, many, many years ago, there was an old man and his wife who lived in a little cottage beside a big wood. They had 3 sons, called Kurt, Conrad, and Hans. The father was very proud of his 2 elder boys, who were great tall fellows, but he never troubled about Hans, the youngest son, who, poor boy, often fared rather badly, as he only got whatever his brothers did not care to keep. He was never allowed to join in their games or trials of skill, in which the father trained his elder boys but had to stop at home doing the housework and helping his mother in the kitchen. She was, indeed, the only one who ever showed him any love or kindness. Thus poor Hans was often very sad and lonely, and so, in order to while away the time and have some kind of companionship, he got a kitten from a neighbour, teaching it all kinds of tricks. And as the animal grew older, it became so attached to Hans that it followed him about wherever he went. So matters went on till all 3 brothers were grown up. Kurt and Conrad gave themselves great airs, for, being tall and robust and well skilled in all games of strength, they laid down the law whenever they appeared on the village green, and bragged so loudly that most people were afraid to contradict them, more especially as their father backed them up in everything. He thought they could do no wrong, whereas Hans was always wrong and of no use at all. He ought, in fact, to have been a girl, always pinned to his mother's apron string. And thus ignored by his father and set aside by his brothers, there was only his mother to stand up for Hans. But she only loved him all the more, and he in return was devoted to her. One day Kurt and Conrad came home from the village, where they had come off victors in every trial of strength on the green, and so proud were they of this success that they begged their father to let them start on their travels and go and visit the king, whose kingdom lay on the opposite side of the great arm of the sea near which stood their hut. At first the father did not like the idea of parting with his sons, but when he looked at them and saw what great strong fellows they were, he felt convinced that they would certainly win riches and renown, so he agreed to let them go, fully convinced they would return both famous and wealthy. Not long after this, the father heard in the village that a big ship lay in the offing, so he told his wife she must get new shoes for Kurt and Conrad, as well as money for the journey, for he meant them to go to the great kingdom across the water, where they would be sure to win both fame and riches. The old woman did her best to obey her husband's behests. She took the great hanks of flax she had spun during the winter, and having sold these in the village, she bought new shoes for Kurt and Conrad with some of the money, keeping the rest for their journey. But when Hans saw all these preparations going on, he had no rest or peace, and a great longing came over him to be allowed to go with his brothers. Plucking up his courage, he went to his father and begged and entreated to be allowed to accompany Kurt and Conrad. At first the old man was very irate at what he considered Hans' impertinence and angrily refused. But when he came to think over it, he decided that he would rather not have him at home alone when the others were away, so he told him he might go, but only on condition that he did not join his brothers. He must keep quite apart from them, so that they need not be ashamed before strangers of its being known that such a small, useless fellow was their brother. Although this was not a very gracious permission, Hans was only too pleased to get leave of any sort, so he hastened to his mother and begged her to try and fit him out also, like his brothers. Kurt and Conrad, hearing that Hans had likewise got permission to go, hastened their own preparations and started at once, as they did not want him to go with them. But he was so anxious to get away and helped his mother so effectually that he was ready almost as soon as they were. When he came to bid her farewell, she gave him a small purse with her savings in it, and then handed him her oven crutch. "Two, "Take this also, Hans," she said. "You will find it very useful, for you can use it either as a walking stick or a weapon of defense if you are in danger, and you will never lose your way, so long as you have it in your possession." Hans thanked her warmly, bade his father goodbye, and with another loving farewell to his mother, went forth on his travels, his cat sitting gravely on his shoulder. He hurried along as quickly as he could, hoping he would yet be in time to overtake his brothers. But when he got down to the shore, there was no sign either of them or the ship, which had evidently sailed some time before. Unwilling to lose any chance, Hans kept along the shore for some time, thinking that perhaps the vessel had gone into some of the fjords that surrounded the coast, but seeing no sign of a sail, he at last left the beach as the sun was setting, and took a path leading up towards the hills. His cat, who had sat on his shoulder all this time, now jumped to the ground, purring and arching his back as he trotted beside Hans. Suddenly, a huge bird came flying rapidly towards them. Hans at once saw that it was a dragon, so he took a firm grasp of his iron crutch, waited till the creature was within reach, then, throwing it, hit him so cleverly that he fell to the ground, whereupon the cat, making a spring, speedily put an end to the monster. When Hans ran up, he saw that the bird held something white between its talons, and, stooping down, perceived it was a little girl, who cried most piteously. Hans tenderly lifted the little thing in his arms, and tried his best to quiet her. But it was not till the big cat came up purring and rubbing itself against the wee creature that she ceased her sobbing and was comforted. Hans was now somewhat at a loss as to what he had best do. Night was coming on. There was no house in sight, and no food at hand. But just as he was driven to his wits' ends, he saw a little old man running towards him, puffing and panting. As soon as he came up to Hans, he thanked him warmly for having rescued his child from the dragon. He was a quaint-looking little man, almost a dwarf, but when he took the child in his arms and began to soothe and quiet it, his face was so kind and gentle that Hans, who had expected to pass the night out of doors, gladly accepted his offer to go home with him and stay the night. They walked on a long way, Pussy always trotting by her young master's side, till at length they came to a big stone or rock. Here the dwarf paused, and, knocking 3 times, the stone opened. Then the dwarf bade Hans enter, and, giving 3 taps, the stone again closed. When Hans looked round, he was surprised to find himself in a fine large room, fitted up with every comfort. Great couches, spread with soft rugs, ran along 2 sides. In one corner was the hearth, on which a bright fire was burning, and on the other side was a table with some chairs beside it, and covered with various papers and quaint instruments. The old man put the child into a pretty little cot, and after he and Hans had partaken of some food, he invited the latter to rest. Hans, nothing loath, threw himself on one of the couches, with his cat beside him, and, thoroughly tired out with all the excitement of his departure and the long distance he had walked, fell asleep almost as soon as his head rested on the pillow. But even in his sleep he heard the dwarf working at his papers during the greater part of the night. Next morning, after they had breakfasted, and Hans was ready to start forth on his travels, the dwarf again thanked him for his timely rescue. "I can never be grateful enough to you for saving my child," he continued. "And now I am going to give you 3 things, which I hope will be useful to you, though nothing can ever cancel my debt to you." "Indeed, you owe me but small thanks," replied Hans, laughing. "It was really my cat who saved your child, by killing the dragon ere I came up to him." But though Hans declared he wanted no payment, the dwarf would take no denial. "You see this small stone," he said. "It possesses the power of making whoever holds it in his hand invisible. This sword," he continued, drawing forth a tiny but exquisitely damascened sword, is both sharp and strong, and though small enough to carry in your pocket, you have but to express the wish when you need to use it, and it will at once attain its full size and strength. And here," he added, "is my third gift. It is, as you see, but a tiny little ship, like a child's toy, so small that you can easily carry it also in your pocket. And yet, whenever you desire, it will become as large as you may need it, either to go on a river or across the sea, and it further possesses the property of being able to sail, no matter whether there is any wind or not." It was in vain that Hans protested. He had in no way earned such valuable gifts. The dwarf insisted, so Hans was fain to take the precious treasures, thanking him most warmly for his great kindness. He then bade him farewell, kissed the pretty child who clung round his neck, and, taking up his iron crutch, shouldered his cat and departed. He drew forth the little ship from his pocket, and, putting it in the water, said, "Ship, ship, grow larger." Immediately the tiny boat expanded, and behold, a beautiful vessel lay there at anchor. Hans got on board, and then, having said where he wished to go, the vessel sailed merrily along towards the kingdom on the opposite side of the big sea. When they were halfway across, a violent thunderstorm came on, but though he noticed that the other vessels near him were tossed about by the great waves, his ship sailed straight on towards its destination, and never lay to or swerved aside till it was safely anchored in its destined port. As soon as Hans landed, he said, "Ship, ship, grow smaller," and immediately the great vessel grew smaller and smaller, till it was like a tiny little model which he could easily put into his pocket. Making sure that he had both his other treasures safely stowed away, Hans, with his faithful cat mounted on his shoulder, made his way inland. Presently he came to a small wood, and here, sitting down beneath a fine big oak tree, near which ran a bright sparkling stream, he decided to remain for a short time, studying the people and their habits, ere he went on to the king's palace. Thanks to his faithful cat, he never lacked food, for Puss went out night and morning, always returning with a rabbit or a bird for her master's dinner and supper. Meanwhile, Kurt and Conrad, on their arrival, had gone straight to the palace, and had asked the king's permission to remain the winter with him. Although he did not really require their services, the king, seeing what fine, strong fellows they were, gladly consented. So they joined the royal household, and were soon known as the merriest among the party, often boasting of their great feats of strength and the valiant deeds they had done. After some weeks, Hans too arrived at the palace. At first he kept somewhat in the background, where no one noticed him, but whence he was able to observe everything that went on. Now, the king had no son, but an only daughter named Gerda, who was both beautiful and wise. The king, who was getting old, was anxious to see her happily married, but although he had received numerous offers for her hand from neighbouring princes and other strangers who had heard of the princess's beauty and wit, she had refused them all, for Gerda was difficult to please. At length one day, just at the commencement of winter, and when all the foreign princes and courtiers were assembled in the big hall of the palace, the king announced that he had quite made up his mind to give his daughter, together with the half of his kingdom during his lifetime, to whosoever would bring him by Christmas Eve the 3 most precious treasures in his kingdom. These were a chessboard and men, made of pure gold and silver, a gold-handled sword, set with precious stones, in a golden scabbard, and with an unbreakable blade, and which always killed your enemy, and a wonderful bird with golden plumage, which, when it sang, could be heard in every part of the kingdom. Yet its wondrous melodies were so sweet and soft that they were not too loud even when quite near. These marvelous treasures, said the king, had originally belonged to his ancestors, but during a great war with the giants many years ago, they had been carried off and were now in possession of a terrible ogress, who lived on a rocky and almost inaccessible island and always kept these treasures in a cave, on a shelf above her head, and they could only be taken away while the giantess was asleep. The courtiers did not pay much attention to the king's words. They had heard them before, and they also knew that all those who had ventured on this quest had either never been heard of again, or, if they returned, were maimed both in body and mind. Some of the foreign princes, however, started off, hoping they might succeed. But when days elapsed and they did not return, Kurt and Conrad thought they would like to try. Knowing how big and strong they were, the task did not seem an impossible one to them, and they were eager to make the venture. Kurt, therefore, as the eldest, came first before the king, and said that if he could have a ship and crew, he would gladly start in search of the treasures. The king at once acceded to his request, a vessel was fitted out, and Kurt sailed away. After many days, he at length reached the island, but being still daylight when they arrived, they kept well out of sight, and did not attempt to land till it was dusk, when Kurt hoped the giantess might be asleep. Then, making his way cautiously to the cave where she lived, he peeped in, and there, sure enough, lay the great ogress, fast asleep on her bed. Creeping cautiously along the floor, Kurt looked up for the shelf, and there he saw the 3 golden treasures. He hardly knew which to take first, so he decided to begin with the most difficult one, and, cautiously stretching forth his hand, laid hold of the bird, which sat on its perch with its head tucked under its wing, thinking to put it in his pocket. But, unfortunately, he grasped it too roughly, and immediately the bird began to screech so loudly that the whole cave shook and trembled. In an instant the giantess sprang from her bed, caught hold of Kurt, threw him down on the ground, and tied his hands and feet firmly with ropes. "Ha! Ha!" she laughed. "Here is another one. What fools they all are! To think they could outwit me! But this one will do nicely for my Christmas dinner when I have fed him up a little." And with these words, and despite his loud cries and remonstrances, she trundled him into a small cave at the back. "And you need not fear that I shall starve you," she grinned maliciously, "for I want you to get nice and fat. At present you are so thin, you are not worth eating." So saying, she ran out of the cave and hurried down to the shore, hoping to catch some of the crew, and so fill her larder still further. But no sooner did the men see the monster running down to the shore than they rowed back to the ship with all their might, and, lifting the anchor, set sail at once, and were soon out of sight. When the men returned home and described the awful ogress who had raced down to the shore to catch them, the king feared there was but little hope that Kurt would ever be heard of again. But after a few days, Conrad began to think that if he had gone, he would have managed more cleverly than Kurt, so he asked the king if he would fit out a ship for him and let him try his luck. The king, anxious to recover his treasures, at once agreed, and full of hope, feeling quite sure his skill and cleverness would not fail him, Conrad started on his journey. But, alas, he was no more lucky than his elder brother. When he got to the cave, he also found the giantess asleep, and, after considering which of the 3 treasures he should take first, he decided for the sword. "The bird may make a noise if it sees me," he thought, "whereas if I have the sword, should the giantess awake, I will kill her, and then secure all 3 treasures." So he watched for a few minutes to make quite sure that both the giantess and the bird were asleep, Then, stealing cautiously on tiptoe across the floor of the cave, he reached up to the shelf and stretched his hand out to take the sword. But, alas! In his eagerness he only grasped the handle of the weapon, and with a loud crash the scabbard fell down. The bird began to scream, and in an instant the giantess sprang from her bed and had Conrad down on the floor, where she at once tied him up with ropes, as she had his brother. "Ha, ha!" she croaked. "Here is another one. Oh, these fools, these fools! But if they will only come on fast enough, I need not stint myself, for I shall have a well-stocked larder by Christmas time." And ere he knew what was to happen to him, Conrad found himself inside the small cave beside his brother Kurt. "Don't be afraid that I shall starve you," laughed the ogress. "You shall have plenty of food, and you must eat all you can and get fat as quickly as possible, and then I shall release you." And she grinned and laughed so loudly that the whole cave shook and trembled as if there had been an earthquake. Soon after the second vessel had returned to the court, the men giving the same account of what had occurred as those in the first vessel, Hans suddenly disappeared. He had become such a great favourite at court that everyone was very sorry when he thus suddenly vanished. But he too was determined to try his luck and see if he could not carry off the treasures, and so win the beautiful Princess Gerda, who had been most kind to him during his stay at her father's court. So, one evening, just as the sun was setting, he walked quietly down to the shore, Puss, as usual, sitting on his shoulder, and, having placed his little ship in the water and pronounced the magic words, he arrived at the Giantess's island about the middle of the day. Having landed, Hans took his stone out of his pocket, and thus at once becoming invisible, started off for the ogress's cave. Looking in, he saw it was empty, so, although he was invisible, he thought it better to hide behind a projecting bit of rock, in case she might knock up against him. As evening closed in, the giantess returned. But no sooner had she entered the cave than she sniffed about in all directions. "Phew! It smells of humans here," she muttered. Not seeing anyone, however, she concluded it must be the two men she was fattening up in the inner cave. So, after a little time, she lay down on her bed. For some time she could not sleep, and kept on muttering, "Phew! It is very strange that I should smell those humans so strongly tonight. I could have sworn there was a fresh human here." At last, after tossing about restlessly, she dropped off asleep. Hans crept forth softly, but the fire on the hearth had died so low he could not well see his way, and stumbled over a small stone. In an instant the golden bird raised its head, but just as it was going to give a shrill scream, Hans's big cat pounced on it and silenced it. Then the giantess started up, and, jumping out of bed, began feeling all round the walls, swearing angrily. Hans knew that he must kill her, for, though he was invisible, if she caught hold of him she would certainly kill him. He therefore drew the sword which the dwarf had given him out of his pocket and wished it to grow bigger. Then, when the giantess came near him and stretched out her huge arms to throw him down, Hans, with one blow of his sword, cut off her head, which rolled away into a corner. Hans then blew up the fire and began searching round the cave in addition to the king's 3 treasures. He found several great chests filled with gold and precious stones. Then he noticed that there was a smaller cave at the back, and, lighting a pine knot, he entered and found his brothers. He immediately loosened their bands, and they were both so grateful to be freed from the terrible fate in store for them that they ever after treated him as true brothers should. They all 3 then set to work and carried the treasures from the cave to the ship, and when everything had been taken on board, they quickly returned to the king's country, where they arrived on Christmas Eve, greatly to the astonishment of the whole court, who had quite given them up as lost. But greater still was the surprise of everyone When Hans presented the king with the 3 treasures which had been so long lost and were now once again restored to the kingdom, the king was so delighted at having at last gained his wish and recovered the long-lost treasures that he told Hans he should always look upon him as a dear son, and that he should certainly marry his daughter. So Hans was dressed in royal robes, and very shortly after married the fair Princess Gerda, who had long secretly admired him. The wedding was held with all possible magnificence. No expense was spared, and gifts were given to all the poor in the land. The king then divided his kingdom in half, putting Hans in charge of one, whereupon he sent for his father and mother and gave them a good house and sufficient money to live in comfort for the rest of their days. And the 2 elder brothers were also provided for. Hans and Gerda reigned long and happily. Puss always had a place of honour beside his beloved master, and lived long enough to see Hans's children and even grandchildren. The Giantess and the Granite. But once upon a time there lived a king and queen who were greatly beloved by all their people. They had only one son, named Sigurd, who, even as a boy, was distinguished for his marvellous skill and dexterity in all manly sports and pastimes, whilst his strength was only equalled by his wisdom and his handsome person. Years passed on. Sigurd had become a man, when one day the king called him to him. "My son," he said, "it is now time for you to choose a fitting bride. I am getting old, and cannot expect to live much longer. You must take my place in a few years, and must try to gain men's respect and esteem by showing yourself capable of winning a princess worthy to share your throne. Visit first the country of Hardrada, my friend. His daughter is indeed, I hear, a marvel of beauty and goodness." Sigurd at once prepared to start on his journey. With a few chosen companions, he set sail in his noble galley, the high prow breasting the waves and the stern, all gorgeous with carving and gilding, glittering in the sun. After sailing for some days over the tossing waters, the vessel at length reached Hardrada's country. It was night, one of those glorious summer nights of the north, when the moon is almost as brilliant as the sun. The bold shore, with its strange, grotesque crags and peaks, seemed utterly unapproachable, till suddenly a large creek or fjord was seen, at the head of which rose the king's palace. The windows were all ablaze with light, and the sounds of music and revelry told the travellers that some banquet was in progress. Leaving their ship, Sigurd and his companions proceeded towards the palace, where they received the warmest of welcomes from the king and his daughter Helga. The princess was indeed all she had been pictured, tall and beautiful, and so gentle and charming that Sigurd made up his mind to win her. Next morning he acquainted the king with the object of his journey, and gained his consent. Hardrada was indeed anxious to have a son-in-law to share the cares of his kingdom, which, now that he was an old man, weighed heavily upon him. As a condition of his remaining with Hardrada, Sigurd only stipulated that he should return to his own country directly his father sent for him. So the marriage of Sigurd the Brave with Helga the Fair took place with great pomp and rejoicing, thanes and nobles coming from all parts to bring presents to the young people. Sigurd and his wife loved each other very dearly, and their happiness was completed when, after the lapse of a year, a son was born to them, inheriting the beauty of the mother and the strength and handsome form of the father. 3 happy years thus passed away, little Kurt being 2 years old, when Sigurd received the news of his father's death and a recall to his native land. It was a sad parting between Helga and her father, but Sigurd dared not linger, and once more the beautiful Viking ship started on its voyage through the sun-tipped waves, bearing the young king and his wife and child. For several days the wind was favourable, but when within a day's sail of Sigurd's country, the vessel ran into an extraordinary calm. Day after day, the sun blazed down fierce and strong. Not a breath of air was to be felt. In the forepart of the vessel, the men had all gone below. Sigurd's companions were also asleep, while he and his wife remained on deck beneath the awning, talking quietly, with little Kurt playing at their feet. After a little, a strange drowsiness seemed to overpower Sigurd himself, and, declaring he could no longer keep awake, he too went below and fell asleep like the others. Helga was now quite alone on deck with her boy. Suddenly, as she was playing with him, she saw a strange object moving slowly along the smooth surface of the water. Shading her eyes with her hands, she watched it, and as it came nearer, she made out that it was a boat, with a curious, ungainly form seated in it rowing. Nearer and nearer it came, with silent, swift strokes, and as it touched the vessel with a hard sound, the queen saw that it was very large and cut out of granite. With one spring, the terrible giantess who had been rowing it was on deck. Like one in a dream, the queen could neither move nor utter a sound to arouse the king or the ship's crew. She seemed held by an invisible power. The giantess came up to her and, snatching away the child, placed him behind her. Then she proceeded to take off all the young queen's beautiful embroidered robes, leaving her only a single linen garment. And as she herself put on Helga's clothes, she gradually also assumed her shape and likeness. Lastly, she seized the queen and placed her in the granite boat, saying as she did so, in a terrible voice, "Obey my words and my magic spell. Thou must neither rest nor pause on the way, till thou reachest my brother in the lower regions." The poor queen, half fainting and utterly powerless, sat still and silent in the boat like a statue. With a strong push, the giantess sent the boat from the vessel's side, and it was speedily lost to sight. Then little Kurt began to cry. In vain the giantess tried to soothe him. The more she attempted it, the worse he became, till at length, losing all patience, she snatched him up and carried him down to the king. Waking him roughly, she upbraided him loudly for leaving her alone on deck with the child. "It was most careless and negligent of you," she went on. "Someone ought to have been left on guard while you were asleep. No one can tell what may happen when one is thus left alone. As it is, I found it impossible to quiet the child. I have therefore brought him down here, which is the proper place for him. It is high time you roused your lazy crew. A favourable wind has at last sprung up, and we can have a chance of getting off this wretched ship." Sigurd was astonished at being addressed by his queen in such terms. In all their married life he had never heard her speak like that. He, however, decided to take no notice of it. She must be overtired with the heat, he thought, and, answering her very gently, he endeavoured to quiet the child. The little fellow, however, sobbed and cried as much as ever. By this time the crew were aroused, the sails hoisted, and, the wind freshening splendidly, they reached land the following day. Here the whole country was still in mourning for the late king, but the people rejoiced greatly when it became known that Sigurd had returned in safety. He was crowned amid universal acclamations, and at once took the reins of government into his hands. But ever since the strange calm at sea, the king's little son had never ceased crying and sobbing, especially in the presence of his supposed mother, while before that time he had been a remarkably happy, affectionate child. The king, therefore, chose a nurse for him from among the people at his court, and when he was with her, the little fellow seemed to be once more the bright, happy child he had been. The king could not, however, understand the change that had come over the queen ever since their journey. She, who formerly had always been so good and gentle, was now obstinate, cross, and untruthful. And ere long others began to notice the disagreeable, quarrelsome nature of the king's wife. Now, there were at the court 2 young men who were so devoted to playing chess that they would sit for hours over their game, instead of joining in the outdoor sports of the other young courtiers. As they were the king's cousins, their room was in the palace, and it happened to be next to that of the queen. She had been particularly rude and disagreeable to them ever since she came, and they would have been glad to revenge themselves upon her in any way. One day, hearing her moving about and talking angrily, they looked through a slit in the door, and distinctly heard her say, "When I yawn slightly, I grow small and dainty, like a young maiden. When I give a bigger yawn, I grow into half a giantess. But when I stretch out my arms and yawn with all my might, I return to my original size and become a mighty giantess." And as she said these words, she stretched herself, yawned frightfully, as if her jaws would break, and suddenly grew into a monstrous and terrible giantess. Then, stamping her foot, the floor opened, and up came a 3-headed giant, bearing a huge trough of raw meat. Greeting the queen as his sister, he placed the trough before her, and she devoured the contents, never resting till she had emptied it. The 2 young courtiers watched this strange scene, though they could not hear all that the giantess and her brother said to one another. They were horrified to see how greedily she devoured the raw meat, and amazed at the quantity she ate, for at the king's table she only picked daintily at the dishes. As soon as she had emptied the trough, the 3-headed giant disappeared in the same manner as he had come, and the queen, giving a slight yawn, at once assumed her human figure again. The young princes then returned to their game, discussing the mystery in undertones. "And what of the king's little son all this time?" One evening, when the nurse had lighted her lamp and was playing with the child in her arms, some of the boards in the centre of the floor opened, and a most lovely lady, wearing only a single white linen garment, stepped forth. Her waist was encircled by a heavy iron ring, to which was attached a chain, which descended right down through the hole in the floor. With a soft little cry, she ran up to the nurse, took the little boy in her arms, kissed him and fondled him, and, after lavishing no end of caresses on him, gently placed him back in his nurse's arms and disappeared in the same way as she had come, the floor closing over her again. All this time she never spoke a single word. The nurse was greatly amazed at the incident, but, startled though she was, she did not say a word to anyone. But next evening the same thing occurred. The white-robed lady came up through the floor, took the child, kissed and caressed him lovingly, and then replaced him in his nurse's arms. But this time, when she prepared to descend, she murmured in sorrowful tones, "Twice this happiness has been permitted. Once more, and then all will be over." Then she disappeared, and the floor closed over her as before. The nurse became greatly alarmed when she heard the white lady say those words. She feared that some danger must threaten the child, and yet she had been much taken with the stranger, who had caressed the boy as if he were her own. She therefore thought it best to speak to the king, tell him what had happened, and beg him to be present at the time when the white-robed lady was wont to appear. The king listened attentively to the woman's story, and, suspecting foul play, promised he would be there. The following evening, therefore, found him betimes in the nursery, seated in a chair, with his sword drawn, close to the spot where the stranger had always appeared. He had not long to wait. With a faint grating noise the boards opened, and forth stepped the beautiful white-robed figure, with the iron ring round her waist and the long trailing chain. In an instant Sigurd recognized in her his own beloved wife, Helga, and quick as lightning he seized her in his arms, and with one stroke of his sword cut the chain that fastened her. Immediately the most terrible groans and rumblings issued from the earth. The whole castle rocked and trembled, and everyone thought that an earthquake was taking place. But in a short time the unearthly sounds ceased without any damage having been done. Then Helga related to her dear lord all that had befallen her, how the wicked giantess had come to the ship in her granite boat when they were all asleep, and with her magic power had taken away all her clothes and put them on herself. When she had placed me in the granite boat, it floated on by itself, until the ship was quite out of sight, she continued, and then I perceived we were going towards a large, dark object, which, as we came near to land, I saw was a huge three-headed giant. He wanted me to marry him, but I steadfastly refused to be his wife, whereupon he chained me up in a big, lonely cave, telling me I should never be free unless I consented. Every second day he came, repeating the same request and the same threats. Then, as time went on and I saw no hope of help, I began to think how I could escape his hands. At last I told him that I would be his wife if he would allow me to visit my son on the earth for 3 days running. At first he would not consent, but when I persisted he gave in, but I had to promise that I would not say who I was. He then placed this iron ring round my waist, to which he attached a chain, the other end being fastened to himself. I hoped that perhaps one evening you might be there when I came to see our little Kurt. How sadly my heart failed me when the second evening passed without my seeing you. But my prayers never ceased, and now my reward has come. The terrible groans when you cut the chain must have been the giant. He would fall when the strain was suddenly taken off the chain, for he lives right under the castle. He probably broke his neck when he fell, and the terrible shock must have been his death throes. Now the king saw clearly why he could not reconcile the behavior of the giantess with that of the gentle Helga, his own dear queen. The hideous impostor, who had now reverted to her original form, was summoned before the state council, and, as additional evidence against her, the 2 young princes related what they had heard and seen. She was condemned to be stoned to death, and her body was put into a sack and torn to pieces by wild horses. Then the real queen was invested with all her rightful honours and soon won the hearts of her people. And little Kurt's nurse was not forgotten. She was married to a great nobleman, the king and queen giving her a rich dowry. She and her husband remained to the end of their days the friends of Sigurd and Helga. Greybeard. Chapter 1. The Strange Adventures of Gaia. Once upon a time there lived a king and queen in a magnificent palace, surrounded by lovely gardens. Beyond them there stretched out great fields and meadows, in which grazed large flocks of sheep and herds of cattle, all of which belonged to the king, and beyond these again there was a beautiful big forest. But in addition to all this, they had an only child called Sigrid, who was known as the fairest princess in all the land. Now, the king of one of the neighbouring kingdoms wanted to marry the princess, and as he was very rich, her father and mother thought they could not do better than give him their daughter. But Sigrid much preferred her young cousin Olaf, who, having lost his parents when a child, had been brought up with her, and who was as brave and handsome as the king, her suitor, was old and ugly. When her father and the queen found that the princess would have nothing to say to the old king, they determined to send Olaf away. "But we must be careful how we do it, and pretend it is for his good," said the queen, "for remember, he has a fairy godmother." So the king sent for Olaf his nephew, and told him he wished him to travel for a year and see something of the world. "For it is not a good thing," said he, "for a young man always to stay at home. Go, therefore, to all the neighbouring kingdoms and see what is done in other lands." The parting between Olaf and Sigrid was very sad, for he feared that the king and queen would force her to marry the rich old king during his absence, and Sigrid dreaded the dangers that might befall Olaf during his travels. But they promised to remain true to one another, and that nothing but death should part them. And then Olaf started on his journey. Now, on the borders of the king's forest, there lived an old man and his wife. The old man was called Geir, and his wife Trude. The old couple were very, very poor. Their little hut contained only the barest necessaries, but they had one cow, and having no children, the old man and his wife managed to live on the milk from their cow, and on the roots they gathered in the king's forest. One Sunday, Trude, feeling very tired, said she would stay at home and rest, while her husband went alone to the village church. The pastor's sermon that Sunday was on charity, and Geir returned home greatly delighted with what he had heard. In the evening, as they were sitting beside the hearth, his wife asked him what the sermon had been about. "Oh," said Geir, "it was the best sermon I have ever heard. The pastor said that, whoever gave away what he possessed, it would be returned to him 100-fold, and I mean to try it." "Ah," said his wife, shaking her head, "I don't think he can quite have meant that. You must have misunderstood him." But Geir maintained that he was right, and so they went on disputing for more than an hour without either convincing the other. The next morning, the old man hastened into the forest, and getting together a lot of woodcutters, he persuaded them to help him to build 100 stalls. His wife grew very angry, and scolded him well for his folly, as she called it, but he turned a deaf ear to all her remonstrance and continued his work. When the stalls were ready, Geir sat down and began to think who would be the best person to give his cow to, and so get 100 cows in return. "Surely there is no one so rich as the king," soliloquized Geir. "He could easily give me 100 cows for my one cow." And thus thinking, he led forth his cow, despite all the angry protestations of his wife. When he had gone about halfway, a tremendous storm arose. Heavy black clouds rolled up from the north, the lightning flashed, and he could hardly stand up under the drenching showers of rain and hail, whilst the cow, terrified at the noise and darkness, struggled frantically to get away. "Alas," sighed the old man, "I fear I shall have to let her go, for I cannot hold on much longer. It is so dark, I cannot see a step before me, nor do I know in which direction to travel. Alas, alas! It will be a wonder if I ever reach home alive." While he was thus wandering helplessly about in the dark, bewailing himself, and not knowing which way to turn, he suddenly saw an old woman standing before him, with a large sack on her shoulders. "What are you doing out in such weather with your cow?" she asked. Then Geir told her why he had set forth with his cow, and what a rich return he hoped to get. "You will certainly lose your own cow, in place of getting 100 new ones, and probably lose your own life too," said the old woman. "You had much better give me your cow, which is leading you a fine dance, and take this sack in exchange. See, you can easily carry it on your back, and I promise you, you will find it contains good flesh and bones." At first Geir would not hear of the exchange, but finding the animal grow more and more restive and wild, he at last consented, and no sooner had the old woman got the cow than both she and it disappeared. After some difficulty, the old man managed to lift the sack onto his shoulders, and, the storm having exhausted itself, made the best of his way home. groaning and panting under his burden, which seemed to grow heavier and heavier as he went on. At length he reached his hut and told his wife what had happened to him, making a great to-do over the sack he had carried and all the good food it contained. "Oh dear, cried Trude, wringing her hands. "I do think you grow more stupid every day. It was bad enough to take away our only cow, and now you come back bringing an old sack." But Gare told her not to scold. She had better fill the big pot with water and put it on the fire. For had not the old woman told him the sack contained good flesh and bones? Trude did as she was told, though grumbling the while. And when the pot began to boil, Gare went to the sack to untie it. But, behold, no sooner did he touch the string than the sack began to move and twist and turn about. "There is something alive inside," cried Trude, terrified. "Open it quickly." And when Gare had untied the string, out stepped a little man dressed from head to foot in grey. Even his hair and beard were grey. "If you want to cook anything for your supper," he cried laughingly, "I hope you will try your hand on something else than me." Poor Gare was struck dumb with amazement, but his wife made up for his silence and jeered and laughed at him for his folly and stupidity. "First you get rid of our only means of support, and now, when we know not how or where to get food for ourselves, you bring home another mouth to feed, and so add to our burden. You surely must have lost the little wit you ever had." And thus the war of words raged till the man in grey said, "Your wrangling will do none of us any good. Rather let me go out and see if I cannot bring back some food for supper. We shall certainly not grow fat on your quarrels." So saying, and without awaiting the reply, he opened the door and sallied forth in the darkness. And ere the old couple could come to any decision as to who or what he was, good genie or wicked sprite, the grey man returned, bringing back with him a nice fat sheep ready killed. "There," he said, throwing it down. "Now you can prepare some food so that we may eat." Gare scratched his head and looked at Trude. She returned the glance, and then they both looked at the grey man. Surely he must have stolen the sheep. They did not know what to do, but at length hunger got the better of their scruples, and, following the directions of Greybeard, as they called him, they cut up the sheep, cooked a portion of it for their supper, and lived in comfort on the remainder for several days. When that sheep was finished, Greybeard brought in another, then a third, then a fourth, and also a fifth. By this time Greybeard had become a very welcome guest, and the old people wondered how they could ever have lived without him. Chapter 2. How Greybeard outwitted the king and won Princess Sigrid, and now we must take a peep at the king's palace. It was just a year since Prince Olaf had started on his travels, and as nothing had been heard of him from any of the knights or wandering minstrels who travelled about from one country to another, the king and queen told Sigrid that it was no use waiting any longer, and that she must marry the rich old king. In vain she protested that she would rather not marry at all if she could not wed Olaf. But the king said that was all nonsense. Princesses must marry. And so the preparations for the wedding were begun, for both the king and queen determined that the marriage feast should be on a most magnificent scale. All the neighbouring kings and queens and princes and princesses were invited, and as the feasting was to continue for a whole week, all the royal cooks and bakers were busy from morning till night. Now, the royal shepherd had noticed that, for some time past, one of the sheep from his flocks disappeared every few days. He puzzled his head to try and find out the cause, but so far he had not succeeded. And when the fifth sheep disappeared, he went to the king and told him what had happened. "There surely must be a thief about the court," he added. "That is the only way I can account for the loss of the sheep." On hearing this, the king got very angry, and immediately made inquiries if any strangers had been seen in the neighbourhood lately. At first he could learn nothing, but at last one of the servants said he had heard there was a little man dressed in grey whom no one knew, and who lived in the hut of old Gare and his wife. Then the king sent messengers to the hut, commanding the immediate presence of the stranger in the great audience hall of the palace. The old couple were greatly terrified when they heard this message. They made sure that their kind guest, through whose means they had been preserved from starvation, would be hanged as a thief. But Greybeard did not seem the least frightened, and prepared cheerfully to return with the king's messenger. When he entered the great hall, the king asked him if he was the man who had stolen the 5 sheep. "Yes, sire," replied Greybeard. "I do not deny it." "And pray, may I ask why you did it?" demanded the king. "I did not go very far beyond my rights," replied Greybeard. "Besides, the old people who live in the hut yonder are no longer able to support themselves," he continued. "They had no food, while you, O king, have plenty, and more than you can possibly use. It seemed only fair to me, therefore, that they should have as much as they needed of that which you did not require and could not use." The king was at first inclined to be angry at this cool rejoinder, but he then became amused at Greybeard's coolness. It just reminded him of what Prince Olaf used to do. So he laughed and asked him if the art of thieving was the only thing he had ever learned. "No, sire," replied Greybeard, smiling. "I took no more than I had a fair right to. Neither did I take it for myself, nor did I deprive you of anything you really needed." "Well," said the king, "you certainly are a funny fellow, and always ready with an answer. But though I won't hang you for stealing my sheep, I must give you a lesson. Tomorrow I will send my servants into the forest with my young red bull. If you succeed in stealing him, you shall be pardoned. But if you fail, you shall be hanged." "I do not think I could steal the bull," replied Greybeard, "for, of course, you will have him carefully guarded." "That is your affair," answered the king. "See that you do not fail." When Greybeard returned to the hut, the old people received him with great joy, for they feared they should never see him again. He asked them if they had a stout rope, as he would need it next morning. Trude searched in her cupboards, and luckily found a nice bit of strong rope. This she gave Greybeard, and then all 3 retired to rest. At break of day, Greybeard got up very quietly, dressed himself, and, taking the rope, left the hut. He went to that part of the forest where he knew the king's servants must pass with the young bull. Climbing up into a big oak tree that stood close to the side of the road, he wound the rope round his body and, crawling along a thick branch, he dropped gently from it, the rope under his arms and his head hanging on his breast. Presently he heard the king's servants coming along with the young bull. As they came near the tree, they looked up and saw, as they thought, the grey man, hanging apparently lifeless from the branch. "Aha!" said one. "No doubt he has been robbing others beside our king, and so they have hanged him. Serve him right, the rascal. He will not trouble us again, or try to steal the bull." So they passed on, quite satisfied that their enemy was dead. But no sooner were they out of sight than Greybeard climbed down, and taking a short cut through the brushwood, known only to himself, he was soon well in advance of the men. Quickly climbing up another big oak that stood near the road by which the king's servants had to pass, he again twisted the rope round his body and hung down from the branch. When the men arrived with the bull, they were greatly surprised to see another grey man hanging from the tree. Could there possibly be 2 Greybeards, they asked each other, or was there some magic at work? "Listen," said the chief servant. "We will leave the bull here, run back to the other tree, and find out whether there are 2 Greybeards, or whether the same man hangs from both trees." So saying, they fastened the bull to the tree with a stout rope and ran back the way they had come. No sooner were they out of sight Then Greybeard quickly dropped to the ground, untied the bull, and led him away to the hut. "Here, friends," he called out to the old people, "here is food in plenty. Kill the bull, we will have a good roast of beef. You can then salt down the rest, and make candles out of the fat, but his skin you must keep for me." The delight of the old people at the prospect of such a supply of good food can well be imagined. The king's servants, meanwhile, having gone back to the first oak tree and finding no one there, had returned to the second tree. But when they found that both the bull and Greybeard had disappeared, they began to realize that a trick had been played upon them. So there was nothing to be done but to return to the palace and tell the king what had happened. After hearing their tale, the king at once sent a messenger to Greybeard, telling him to come with all possible speed to the palace. The old couple greatly feared, when they heard his message, that some evil was intended towards Greybeard, and quite expected the king would hang him. But Greybeard told them to keep up a good heart and not to weep, and, whistling cheerfully, he appeared before the king without any sign of fear or dread. "Was it you who stole my bull?" asked the king. "I did not steal it, sire. I had to take it in order to save my life," replied Greybeard. "Well," said the king, "I suppose that is true. I will therefore pardon you again, if you can this night manage to take away the scepter from under my pillow without waking either the queen or me." "That is beyond the power of any man to do," replied Greybeard, "for how can I get at night into your palace, which is always guarded, much less into your bedchamber? Nay, that is your affair. You must see to that," replied the king. "And remember that, if you fail, it means losing your life." And with these words he dismissed him. Then Greybeard returned to the old couple, who welcomed him as if he had indeed returned to them from the dead. Trude had roasted the finest joint, gathered a big bowl of whortlebellies, and baked some nice crisp girdle cakes, so they had a great feast, after which Greybeard asked her to give him one of her nice sleeping potions which she made for Gear when his rheumatism was very bad. "That I will gladly, my son," said Trude heartily. She quickly hung her pot over the glowing embers, putting in henbane and many other herbs, and when the potion was ready, she poured it into a little bottle and gave it to Greybeard. The sun had by this time set like a golden ball, tinting the great brown stems of the tall pines with a rich crimson glow, as Greybeard, with the bottle carefully placed in his coat pocket, made his way back to the castle. Watching his opportunity when the sentry at the little postern gate had turned his back, he slipped through the gate and hid himself in a dark corner behind one of the great buttresses. Presently he heard the gates close for the night, so that there should be no possibility of a thief getting in. When Greybeard thought he had allowed a sufficiently long time to pass to admit of everyone, including the king and queen, being soundly asleep, he stole quietly and cautiously out of his hiding place and along the great passages till he reached the royal bedchamber. Carefully opening the door, he crept softly up to the big couch on which reposed the king and queen. Making sure that they were sound asleep, he drew forth his little bottle, poured some of the contents on his handkerchief, and dropped it lightly over the faces of the royal couple. He waited for a few minutes to see that the sleeping drops had taken effect, and then, slipping his hand under the king's pillow, he slowly and cautiously drew forth the great golden scepter, buttoned it safely inside his coat, and, removing the handkerchief, he hastened back to his hiding place behind the buttress, and as soon as the gate was opened at daybreak, he ran back to old Gear's hut. The next morning, when the king and queen awoke, the former put his hand under the pillow, and behold, the scepter was gone. "Ah, that rascal has been too clever for us again," cried the king, and immediately sent another messenger to Greybeard to summon him to the castle at once. This time, Gear and Trude made sure the king would hang Greybeard, and were almost heartbroken as they bade him farewell. "Did you yourself steal the scepter from under my pillow last night while we were asleep?" asked the king. "Yes, O king," replied Greybeard. "I did not steal it, however, but took it as you told me. I had to do it to save my life." "Well," said the king, "you certainly are a clever fellow. I will therefore pardon you all you have done if this night you can carry off both the queen and me out of our bed. If, however, you fail to do so, you shall certainly be hanged without hope of forgiveness." "That is not possible for anyone to do unassisted," said Greybeard. "Oh, that is your affair. See you to that," answered the king, and dismissed him. Greybeard returned to his hut. The old people were greatly rejoiced to see him, for they quite expected the king would have hung him. But he was more silent than usual, and after they had finished their evening meal, and the old people had gone to bed, Greybeard went out and walked in the moonlight under the tall trees, planning how to carry out the fresh task given him. Presently he returned to the hut and took down the old man's wide-brimmed felt hat that hung on a nail at the back of the door. Boring holes in the brim, he stuck in them some of the candles which Trude had made from the fat of the bull, and also fastened candles in his belt, and then, taking the great leather sack which Ger had made out of the bull's skin, he returned to the palace and stood in front of the chapel steps which faced the king's bedroom. Laying down the sack, he lighted all the candles he had brought, sticking them on his shoulders and wherever he could fasten them, and then rang the chapel bell. This unusual sound in the middle of the night wakened the king and queen. Jumping hurriedly out of bed, they hastened to the window, and there, standing outside the chapel door, they saw a figure, all blazing with light. Greatly startled, they thought it must be a spirit. "Such a visitor must be received with all honor," said the queen. "Let us go out and ask his protection and goodwill." So they put on their very grandest clothes and went out to meet the supposed spirit. Falling on their knees, they begged him to tell them why he had come, and hoped he would not be too severe with them or want them to give away too large a portion of their treasure. Greybeard, looking very stern beneath the light of the blazing candles, said he did not want any of their money, but they must both get inside the sack which he placed on the steps. "Is that all?" cried the king, quite relieved. "Why, that is very easily done." And, helping the queen in first, he crept in after her. But no sooner were they both inside than Greybeard pulled to the string. In vain the king kicked and threatened, the queen adding her cries and tears. Greybeard quietly blew out all the lights, and dragging the sack rapidly across the yard, said, "I am no spirit, O king, but your old friend Greybeard. You see, I have got you and your queen out of your beds as you commanded me to do, and now it is for me to make my conditions. I will not let you out of the sack unless you promise me your forgiveness for what I have done, and also give me your royal word that you will grant the request I will presently make you." The king was so frightened and helpless, fearing that he might die ere Greybeard opened the sack, that he willingly gave his royal word to grant his request, whatever it might be. Whereupon Greybeard untied the sack, and when the king and queen had crept forth, looking very crestfallen, Greybeard said that, as next day was the princess's wedding day, he had now to demand the hand of the fair Sigrid in marriage, as well as the half of the kingdom during the king's lifetime. And further, that old Ger and his wife, who had befriended him in his poverty, should also live at the palace and be amply provided for. The king, having given his royal word, could not of course retract, so he and his queen returned to the palace very sad and sorrowful. For now, instead of having the rich old king for a son-in-law, they had to accept this terrible stranger and lose the half of their kingdom as well. Greybeard, meanwhile, returned to the cottage, and when he told Gia and his wife that instead of losing his life, he was going to marry the princess the next morning, and that they also were to be provided for, they could hardly believe his words. "And now you must put on these smart clothes I have brought you, and go back with me," added Greybeard. And as soon as the old couple were ready, they returned with him to the palace. The morning of the wedding rose bright and sunny, and the old king, who had arrived, was lodged in the palace. Leaving Gia and Trude among the assembled guests, Greybeard went down into the beautiful gardens, and there, seated on the stone bench near the fountain, he saw Sigrid looking sad and pale. She had heard of the grey stranger and all his wonderful doings, and though glad that she was not to marry this ugly old king, she could not forget Olaf. Hearing a step approaching, she looked up and saw Greybeard coming towards her. "Fair princess," he said, kneeling down before her, "do not fear me, but lay your hand in mine, and trust me, believe me, I only wish to make you happy." His voice was so soft, and he spoke so gently, that Sigrid, despite his ugly grey beard, after a moment's hesitation, placed her hand in his. No sooner, however, had she done so, than the quaint grey figure disappeared. Behold! Olaf himself stood before her, and with a glad cry she threw herself into his outstretched arms. Together they then hastened to the king and queen, and Olaf told them how, by the aid of his fairy godmother, he had been able to help the old couple who had fed and sheltered him, and also to claim his cousin's hand when his year of travel was ended. The king having given his word, there was nothing further to be said, and the old king had to return to his own country. The wedding was one of the grandest that had ever been seen, and the feasting lasted a whole month. Olaf and Sigrid lived long and happily together, and after the king's death, Olaf succeeded to the kingdom, which he ruled with such wisdom and goodness, that his reign has ever since been known as the reign of King Olaf the Good. Litill, Tritill, the birds, and the peasant laid. There once reigned a king and a queen, and in the same country there also lived a poor old man and his wife. The king had an only daughter called Enid, who was greatly beloved by both her father and mother. They spared no expense, and she had the best masters and governesses, and a number of servants to wait upon her. But notwithstanding that she was so carefully watched and looked after, she suddenly disappeared. The head governess said she had left her in her room only for a few minutes practicing her harp with two of her maidens in attendance, and when she came back she found both the girls fast asleep and the princess gone. Inquiries were made of everyone, but nothing could be heard of the princess. No one had seen her. She had vanished in the most mysterious manner. The king, in despair, sent out messengers in all directions, and spent a great part of his treasure searching for her, but all in vain. Then, at last, he vowed that he would give the princess in marriage to whoever should be fortunate enough to find her, and also give him the half of his kingdom. But though many of the knights and nobles about the court, eager to secure so great a prize, went off in search of her, they one and all returned empty-handed. Now, the poor old man who lived outside the palace grounds had 3 sons. Their names were Osmund, Tostig, and Harold. The 2 eldest boys were greatly beloved by their parents, but Harold, the youngest and handsomest, was disliked by his father and mother, and both his elder brothers ill-treated him and made him do all the work, while they went out shooting and fishing. When the boys were grown up, Osmund came to his parents and said he would like to start off and see the world, and try to win fame and riches for himself. His father and mother were quite willing he should do so, and providing him with a new pair of boots and a large bag of food, he started off on his journey. After he had gone a long, long way, he arrived at a little hillock. Here he sat down to rest and unpacked his bag of provisions, Just as he was beginning to eat, a tiny little man, dressed in grey, came up to him, begging for a morsel of food. Osmond angrily ordered him away, threatening to beat him if he did not go quickly. After he had rested, Osmond went on again, a long, long way, till he came to another hillock. Here he again sat down to rest, and began to eat. But he had hardly commenced than a still smaller and shabbier little man, dressed in green, came up to him and asked him for a morsel of food. Osmond spoke angrily to him, and sent him away with a volley of abuse. He then went on again, a long, long way, till he reached a large open glade in the wood. Here he sat down on the soft, mossy grass at the foot of a big beech tree, and thought he would eat another morsel. But no sooner had he opened his bag and taken out the food than a whole flock of birds flew down beside him. But he angrily chased them away, and then, having rested himself, went on his way, till he came to a big cave. Looking in, and seeing no one, only a lot of cattle, he thought he would go in and wait till the dawn arrived. Just as the sun was setting, an enormously big giantess walked in. Osmond was greatly startled, but, taking courage, he went up to her and asked whether he might stay the night there. The giantess said yes, on condition that in the morning he would do the work she would require of him. This he promised he would do, so she allowed him to remain the night, she herself retiring into an inner cave. The next morning the giantess told him that he must clean out the cave and put down fresh bedding for the cattle, and that he must have it all finished before the evening, else she would take his life. With these words she went away. Osmond took up a prong he saw standing in a corner, but no sooner did he begin to turn up the straw than the prong stuck fast in the bedding. In vain he pushed and pulled and tried to drag it out. The prong remained firmly fixed, and when in the evening the giantess came home and found that the cave had not been cleaned out, she took hold of Osmond and hung him up to a nail in the cave. Meanwhile Tostig, the second son, thought he, too, would like to go out into the world to seek his fortune, for he felt sure his brother by this time must be quite a rich man. So he told his parents that he did not care to remain at home. Now his elder brother was away, and with only that stupid Harold at home. So, having gained their consent, he, too, started off, provided with a pair of new boots and a big bag of provisions. But he was not more fortunate than Osmond had been. He flouted the little men while he rested on the hillocks. He chased and killed some of the birds who came flocking round him for crumbs, and when he reached the cave, he also received leave from the giantess to remain the night, on condition that he cleaned out the cave next morning. When he went and took up the prong to throw out the old bedding, it stuck fast in the straw, and no efforts of his could move it. So the giantess, coming home, and finding that he had failed to accomplish his task, took him and hanged him beside his brother. So now there was only the youngest son, Harold, left. But though he was the only one at home, his parents did not love him any better, and the poor lad often felt that his presence reminded them of their lost sons, and that they regretted not having sent him away in their place. So he also decided to go away. I do not suppose I shall win riches and fame. All I hope is that I may be able to earn enough to support myself, and be no longer a burden to you. Then his parents told him he might go, but instead of nice, strong, new boots, they only gave him an old pair of his brother's, and his sack contained nothing but some hard, dry crusts. But Harold started off with a light heart, and as it chanced, he, too, took the same road his brothers had done, and presently he came to the first hillock. "I think my brothers must have rested here, if they felt as tired as I do," he said. "So I will do the same." And seating himself on the hillock, he began to eat one of his dry crusts when, looking up, he saw a little old man in grey standing beside him. Will you share your crust with me? I am very hungry and have had no food today," he said. Harold pitied the old man, who looked so feeble and tired. He begged him to sit down beside him and share his meal. When they had done, the old man got up and, after thanking him, said, "My name is Tritill. Although I am old and feeble, if ever you are in need of help, call me, and I will come to you." So saying, he went round the back of the hillock and disappeared. Harold then continued his journey till he came to the second hillock. "I feel sure my brothers must have rested here," he said. "It is a long way from the last hillock. I too will rest here a while." And he sat down, and opening his bag, took out another crust. Hardly had he done so when a tiny, shabby, little old man dressed in green came up to him and asked for a morsel of food. Harold very good-naturedly asked him to sit down beside him and shared his crust with him. When they had finished eating, the little green man got up and, after thanking Harold, said, "Call me if ever you think I can do you a service. My name is Litill." And he too went away, and was soon out of sight. Harold then continued his journey until he came to the large open glade in the wood. "I am sure my brothers must have rested here," he thought. "I will do the same." And he sat down and took out another crust. No sooner had he done so than a great flock of birds came down. They circled round and round him, and seemed so hungry and fought so eagerly over every crumb he threw them, that Harold's heart was filled with pity. "Poor little things," he said. "They need it more than I do." And he broke up the remaining crusts and threw the crumbs among them. When they had eaten up every crumb, the biggest bird alighted gently on Harold's shoulder and whistled softly. "If ever you think we can do you a service, call us. We shall hear you wherever we are, for we are your birds." And ere he had recovered from his astonishment, they had all flown away and were out of sight. Harold then continued his journey until he too came to the big cave. Looking in, he saw it was full of cattle, and hanging from a beam in one corner, he saw the bodies of his two brothers. Startled at the sight, Harold's first impulse was to go away, but he thought he must first bury his brothers. So he took down the bodies, and seeing a spade near the entrance, he speedily dug a grave and buried them in the sand outside the cave. Just as he had finished, the giantess arrived. Harold, who was very tired, asked her if he might stay the night there. "You may do so, if you will promise to do what I tell you in the morning," answered the giantess. This Harold agreed to, and he slept that night in the cave. Next morning, the giantess, who had slept in an inner cave, told him that he would have to clean out the cave and put down clean bedding for the oxen. "But remember, if your work is not finished when I come home, I shall hang you the same as I did your brothers." And so saying, she went away. Harold took up the prong standing in the corner and began his work. But no sooner had he pushed the prong into the bedding and tried to lift it than it stuck fast to the ground. In vain he used all his strength. The prong remained firmly fixed. In his despair he called out, "Oh, dear Tritill, come and help me." No sooner had the words passed his lips than he saw Tritill standing beside him, who asked what he could do for him. Harold showed him the difficulty he was in. Then Tritill called out, "Brit prong and shovel spade." And immediately the prong pricked up the bedding, and the spade shovelled it away, till in a very short time the cave was all cleaned out and fresh straw put down. Harold thanked him warmly for his help, and Tritill went away. When the giantess came home in the evening and saw that the work was done, she said to Harold, "Oh, man, you have not done this by yourself, but I will let it pass." And she retired into the inner cave. The next morning, the giantess told Harold that she had some fresh work for him to do. He was to carry her own bedding outside the cave, take out all the feathers, spread them out in the sun to air, and then put them back again. But remember, if, when I come back in the evening, there is a single feather missing, I shall hang you as I did your brothers." And with these words she went away. Harold carried out the great feather bed and the big pillows, and as the sun was shining warm and bright, and there was not a breath of wind, he ripped open the seams and spread out the feathers in the sun. No sooner had he done so than a strong wind arose, and in one moment all the feathers were whirled away, not a single one remaining. In despair Harold called out, "Dear Tritill, dear Litill, and all my dear birds, oh, come and help me if you can." And almost before the words had passed his lips, Tritill, Litill, and the whole flight of birds came bringing the feathers with them. And while Tritill and Litill helped Harold to fill the bed and the pillows, and sew them up again, the birds flew round, picking up all the stray feathers, so that none were missing. But out of each pillow they took one feather and, tying them together, told Harold that when the giantess missed them and threatened to kill him, he was to tickle her nose with the feathers. Thereupon Tritill, Litill, and the birds all disappeared. When the giantess came home in the evening, she went up to her bed and threw herself down on it so heavily that the whole cave shook. Then she began carefully feeling all over the bed, and when she came to the pillows she cried out, "Ah, man, I have caught you. There is a feather missing in each pillow. Now I shall hang you like your brothers." But as she took hold of him, Harold quickly pulled the 2 feathers out of his pocket and tickled her nose with them. In an instant the giantess fell back on her bed, looking terribly white and frightened. But Harold laughingly gave her back her feathers, telling her he did not want to keep them. "Ah, man," said the giantess, "I know you did not do this alone, but I will let it pass this time." So, this 3rd night Harold also passed in the cave, and in the morning the giantess said to him, "I have some fresh work for you today. You must kill one of my oxen. Then you must scrape and clean the skin to make a leather bag. Cut up the animal in joints ready for cooking, clean all the entrails, and make spoons out of its horns. All must be finished ere I return this evening. I have 50 oxen, as you see, and it is one of these I want killed. I shall not, however, tell you which one I have fixed upon, that you must find out for yourself. If all is done as I wish when I return, you can depart in the morning and go wherever you like. And, in addition, as a reward, you may choose 3 things from among such of my treasures as I value most. If, however, everything is not finished, or if you kill the wrong animal, then it will cost you your life, and I shall hang you the same as I did your brothers." And so saying, the giantess departed. Harold was sorely puzzled. How could he possibly decide which of the animals the giantess wished killed? Then he remembered his friends. "Dear Tritill, dear Litill, come once again to my aid," he cried. Hardly had the words passed his lips than he saw them both coming towards him, leading a huge ox between them. They at once set to work and killed him. And while Harold cleaned the entrails and cut up the joints, Tritill scraped the skin and prepared it for making the bag, and Litill began fashioning the spoons out of the horns. So the work sped along quickly and merrily, and all was ready ere the sun sank to rest. Harold now told his friends what the giantess had promised him if he should have finished his task ere she returned. "Can you advise me what to ask for?" he said. Then they told him he should first ask for that which was over her bed, then for the chest which stood beside her bed, and lastly for that which was behind the wall of her bed. Harold thanked them warmly for all they had done for him, and said he would do as they had told him, whereupon the little men disappeared. When the giantess came home in the evening and found that Harold had finished all the tasks she had set him, she exclaimed, "Ah, man, You never did all this alone, but you have conquered, so I must let it pass." And so saying, she retired to rest. The next morning, the giantess called Harold into the inner cave and told him he might choose the reward she had promised him, and that then he might go where he liked. "Then," said Harold, "if I may have whatever I like, I choose, first, that which is above your bed, then the chest which is beside your bed, and, lastly, that which is behind the wall of your bed." "Ah, man," cried the giantess, "you have not chosen these things by yourself, but I cannot refuse you. You are too strong for me, and you have conquered, and I must give you the reward you claim." So saying, she mounted some steps above her bed, cut into the rock, and, opening a secret door, she led forth a beautiful maiden. This was none other than the fair Princess Enid, who had disappeared so mysteriously some time ago. "Take her back to her father, and he will reward you as you deserve," said the giantess as she placed the princess's hand in that of Harold. She then opened the lid of the chest beside her bed. This was filled with gold, pearls, and precious stones, and then moving aside the bed, she touched a secret spring, and the wall sliding back, they saw the blue sea, and anchored close to the cave lay a beautiful ship, completely fitted out, her sails all set, and her pennant flying, and possessing the power of sailing wherever its owner wished, without aid of either captain or crew. When the giantess had handed him over these gifts, she told Harold that he would henceforth be one of the happiest and luckiest of men. Harold then carried the chest containing the gold and precious stones on board ship, and then, having arranged some soft cushions for the Princess Enid in the stern of the vessel, they quickly departed and reached her father's country. The delight of the king and queen on recovering their long-lost daughter can be more easily imagined than described. They never tired hearing of the wonderful adventures through which Harold had gone, and the king ordered a great feast in honor of the rescuer of his child, which ended with the wedding of Enid and Harold. The king then made Harold his prime minister, and so well and so wisely did he rule the country, that on the king's death he was chosen to succeed him, and he and Queen Enid lived long and happily together, seeing their children and grandchildren growing up around them. Lorging, Ingibjorg, Chapter 1. Thorwald and Ingibjorg are cruelly treated by their stepmother, who tries to get rid of them. Long ago, when giants and ogres still walked about the earth, in a far distant country, there once lived a king and queen. They had 2 children, called Thorwald and Ingibjorg, but before the children were grown up, the good queen died. The king, who was very fond of his wife, was quite inconsolable at her death. He lost interest in everything, shut himself up in his own rooms, only coming out to sit and weep beside her grave. This went on for so long that at last his ministers came to him and told him that everything was going wrong in his kingdom, and that there was a rumor abroad that a neighboring prince, hearing that the king no longer took any interest in his affairs, meant to cross the water and take possession of the king's throne and lands. They therefore begged him to rouse himself and look out for another wife, and either go forth and seek her himself, or else send his ambassadors to try and bring back a suitable princess. At first the king would not listen to a word they said, but after a time he saw that his ministers were right, so he agreed to fit out some ships and send an embassy to several other countries in order to find some fair princess worthy to share his throne. Soon after the ambassadors had started, and were once fairly on the high seas, a great storm arose. The sky grew black as night, the thunder roared and the lightning flashed, and the wind blew so strongly, driving the ships in all directions, that the sailors quite lost their reckoning. Their rudders were broken, and they drifted about at the mercy of the winds and waves. At length, after many days, they sighted land, but when they came near, They saw it was quite an unknown shore. The chief men of the expedition now disembarked in order to make some inquiries, leaving the sailors in charge of the ships. For some time they could see no sign of any human habitation, and thought they must have landed on some uninhabited island. But at length they arrived at a small farm, consisting of a few wretched huts. Not hearing a sound and seeing no one about, they at first concluded the place was deserted. But when they reached the last hovel, an old woman came forth, who, despite her great age, was both tall and stately, and at once asked them who they were and whence they had come. "We have been driven here by the storm," replied the leader, and he then proceeded to tell her the object of their search. "You certainly have been very unfortunate so far," answered the old woman, "and I fear there is but little chance of your finding what you seek here." While they were talking, the sun had set, and as the weather showed signs of again turning stormy, the ambassadors asked the old woman whether she could give them shelter. At first she absolutely refused, saying her miserable hut was not fitted to receive people accustomed to live in royal castles. But, as the storm increased, they continued to urge her to let them stay, till at length she consented and bade them enter. What was their surprise and astonishment to find the inside of this apparently miserable hut richly fitted up like some kingly apartment. Handsome skins covered the floor, soft couches ran round the walls, which were ornamented with richly chased shields and arms, and a bright fire burnt cheerily on the hearth. As soon as the men were seated, the old woman laid the great oaken table which stood in the centre, and served the strangers with such dainty dishes as might well befit a royal table. "And do you mean to say that you live here all alone?" asked the chief ambassador during the meal. "I might almost say that I do," replied the woman, "for besides myself there is no one here but my only child Guda." "And, pray, may we not see the maiden?" asked the ambassador, for they were all wondering what the girl, living alone with her mother in these strange surroundings, would be like. Again the old woman demurred, but the more she pretended to hesitate, the more the ambassadors urged her, till at last she consented, and said she would bring her daughter. When at last she entered by her mother's side, the ambassadors were almost startled by her marvellous beauty. Tall and fair, like a stately lily, with a perfect wealth of golden hair falling in shining masses to the ground, Guda appeared before them like the goddess Freya. Surely, they thought, nowhere could they find a lovelier maiden to fill the vacant seat beside the king's throne. So, without further hesitation, they at once solicited her hand in marriage in the king's name. The old woman pretended to think they were only joking, and laughed at the idea of the king seeking a wife in a peasant's cottage, adding that poor girls like her daughter had better remain at home, for such grandeur was not for them, and their ignorance of the ways of the world only brought them to shame instead of honor. The king's ambassadors, however, would not be put off, and the more the old woman declared she could not part with her daughter, the more determined they were to take her away with them. At last, seeing the men would take no refusal, she consented to let the girl go, on condition that they would bring her back again, if, on seeing her, the king did not wish to marry her. To this the ambassadors agreed, and then they all retired for the night. Next morning the men prepared to return to the ships, and the old woman said her daughter would be ready to accompany them when she had got her things together. Then, to their surprise, they found she had so many packages that it needed all the ship's crews to carry them to the shore and put them on board. The mother and daughter now went down to the beach together, talking earnestly, but in such low tones that no one could make out what they were saying. But one man heard the old woman say, "Remember, you must send me back the big stone. I will manage the rest." And then they reached the shore, where the old mother kissed her daughter and, bidding her goodbye, wished her all good luck and prosperity. Then the anchors were weighed, the sails were hoisted, and the vessels put out to sea, reaching their destination without any mishaps. When the king heard that his ambassadors had returned, he went down to the shore, accompanied by all the chief officers of his court, to bid the travellers welcome. And when he saw the young girl whom the ambassadors had chosen for his queen, he was greatly delighted, for she was more beautiful than any maiden he had ever seen, and seemed as sweet and good as she was lovely. He conducted her back to the palace in great state. There a magnificent banquet had been prepared, and soon after the wedding was celebrated, amid the rejoicings of the whole island. The feast lasted 3 days, and everyone who saw the fair Queen Gudda in her rich and costly robes, seated on the throne beside her husband, declared no more beautiful queen could possibly have been found. And though the king had loved his first wife, he soon became so completely wrapped up in Gudda that her word was law in everything. Some months after the wedding, a war broke out in a neighbouring kingdom belonging to a cousin of the king, who had, therefore, to start off and help him, as his enemies were too strong for him to fight them alone. The king, therefore, ordered out his war galleys, and, as he expected to be away some time, he, at the queen's request, handed her his royal signet ring, begging her to rule the kingdom during his absence, and be a kind and loving mother to his 2 children, Thorvald and Ingibjorg. This Gudda promised she would do. So the king took a tender farewell of his wife and children, and, getting on board his ship, followed by his men, a strong wind rapidly carried the vessels out of sight. For some little time after the king had left, Queen Gudda was very kind to the children. She had them to dine at her own table, gave them fruit and sweets and toys, and often took them for drives in her beautiful chariot with the cream-coloured horses. Then one day she asked them to go down to the shore with her and play some games. It was a beautiful morning. The sun shone warm and bright. The blue sea was smooth and glistening like a great sheet of glass, and as the tiny wavelets receded, the golden sands were strewn with lovely pink and violet shells and glistening feathery weeds of every hue and shade. "Oh, Thorwald!" cried Ingibjorg, running up to her brother and laughing merrily, her arms filled with long trails of crimson and green seaweed. "Look how beautiful they are! Let us play at being king and queen, and I will make 2 lovely crowns." "No." "Come here, children," said the queen. She had walked some little distance along the shore, and now stood beside a big square stone. Then, as Thorwald and Ingibjorg came near her, she muttered, "Open, O stone!" And at these words, the great square stone parted asunder, showing a large cavity inside, and before the children knew what had happened, Queen Gudda had pushed them both in. The stone closed with a snap, and, giving it a strong shove, she rolled the stone into the sea. She then returned to the castle weeping, telling her attendants that the children had run away, that she had called them to come back, but all in vain. They would not obey. So she now sent out messengers in all directions, pretending terrible grief at their supposed loss. Chapter 3. How the Wald and Ingibjorg found themselves at the witches' island, and what they did, the 2 children. Meanwhile, when they felt the stone closing, tried their utmost to force it open. But all their efforts proved fruitless. The stone remained shut, and the children soon felt, by the rapid motion, that they were fairly out at sea. For, being a magic stone, it floated on the surface of the water instead of sinking to the bottom. The waves tossed it about for many hours, but at length the children felt the motion getting less and less, until at last the stone lay perfectly still. "I think we must be near land now," said Thorwald. "There is no motion at all." "If you think that, why should not you say the same words the queen did?" replied Ingibjorg. So Thorwald waited a little longer in order to make sure it was not merely a temporary lull, and then he called out loudly, "Open, O stone!" And immediately the great stone parted asunder, and Thorwald saw they were close to the shore. The two children then slipped out and paddled through the shallow water to the land. But though they wandered along the fine dry sand for some distance, they could see no sign of any habitation. They therefore determined to try and build a little hut for themselves. Now, Thorwald, although but a young lad, had always gone out hunting with his father, who had given him a small gun and hunting knife. These and his flute, on which he played wonderfully well, the boy never parted with, and he therefore had them with him when he and his sister had gone out with the queen in the morning. Fashioning a rough wooden spade out of some driftwood for Ingibjorg, he used his knife to such purpose that a large hole was soon dug in the dry sand. This he then covered over with branches cut from the brushwood on the rocks, and leaving his sister to collect dry wood for a fire, he went in search of some birds for their supper. But although successful in shooting a couple, there was, alas, no fire to cook them, and poor Ingibjorg, who was getting very hungry, looked sadly at the food they could not eat. "You pluck and prepare the birds," said Thorwald, "and I will go further inland and see if I cannot get some fire." So saying, he went up a narrow valley instead of, as heretofore, keeping along the shore, and after he had gone some little distance, he came to a small, miserable-looking farm. He could see no one about, so he climbed up the steep slanting roof of the centre hut and peeped down the hole which served as a chimney. There he saw an old, very ugly and dirty woman, busily engaged raking out the ashes from the hearth. But he noticed that half the cinders tumbled down among her feet, instead of into the ashpan she held in her left hand. So Thorwald made certain that the old woman must be blind. He determined, therefore, to enter quietly into the house and carry off a few live coals. First slipping down the roof, he crept slowly in at the low door, and then, watching his opportunity, he crawled along the wall till he reached the hearth. Then, seeing a small iron cup, he carefully pushed some glowing coals into it, and seeing no one else about, he made sure the old woman was alone, and while she was still busy raking, he crept out of the hut and, much pleased with his success, hastened back to his sister. Ingibjorg was delighted when she saw him arrive, and, the fire being already laid, a bright flame soon shot up. The birds were roasted, and the two children made a hearty supper, Ingibjorg's merry laugh sounding again as gay as ever. Thorwald, somewhat tired with his day's work, asked his sister to make up a good fire ere they went to sleep, so that it might last all night. But, alas, when they woke next morning, the fire was out, so he had to go again to the old woman's farm to fetch more coals. This time he begged Ingibjorg earnestly not to let the fire out, but, alack! The little princess, though very willing and anxious to please her brother, had not been accustomed to attend to fires, so, though doing her best by making up a huge fire ere she went to sleep, it was out in the morning. Ingibjorg even tried to wake up very early in order to put on fresh wood, but, despite all her efforts, each morning the fire was out, and Thorwald had to go every day to fetch fresh fire. Chapter 3. There for the adventures and escape. Thus, the brother and sister lived for some time on the birds and game that Thorwald killed, and Ingibjorg having made a net out of the long, tough shore grasses. They also managed to catch some fish and crabs, and their days passed pleasantly enough, while every morning Thorwald went up the valley and brought away some live coals, without the old woman ever finding it out. Once, after he had taken away the coals, he heard her mutter, "Ah, those devil's children! They are a long time in coming, but arrive here at last. They must, for I made Guda promise to send them in the stone, and she dare not disobey me." Ah, only let me once get hold of them, and I will very soon put them out of the way." Thorwald thought these words must surely refer to himself and his sister, who had arrived there in such a strange manner. He was, therefore, very careful whenever he came to the hut for the fire coals, to make as little noise as possible. He sometimes scarcely dared to breathe for fear the old woman might discover him. Meanwhile, Ingibjorg, who had been very good about staying alone in their little hut, at last became very curious about the old woman, and begged and entreated Thorwald to let her go with him some day. Thorwald, though willing to please his sister, was afraid to trust her, for he knew that the sight of the queer old woman would make her laugh. But he found it very difficult to deny her anything within his power to grant, and when, therefore, she continued to beg him to take her, he at last consented, on condition that, no matter what she saw or heard, she must promise him she would not laugh, as, if she did, it might cost them their lives. Ingibjorg promised she would keep quite still, so the next day the brother and sister started off together for the old farm. When they got there, they climbed up the sloping roof, and, with another warning to keep silent, Thorwald let his sister peep down through the chimney-hole. But, alas, what Thorwald had dreaded actually took place. The old woman, who stood near the hearth, was raking out the ashes so vigorously that not only did she send them all over the floor instead of into the ashpan, but she made such a cloud of dust that she was soon completely covered from head to foot with a coating of grey ashes, and began to cough violently. When Ingibjorg saw this, she could not repress her laughter, and a merry peal rang out in the clear air. No sooner did the old woman hear this than she chuckled gleefully. "Ha! Ha! So those devil's children have come at last, have they? Ho! 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 What a joke! Now I shall have them! Ha! Ha!" And with these words she rushed out of the house. She was so quick that she came up to the children just as they were sliding down the roof, and they might even then have got away. But that Ingibjorg, at sight of the old woman, could not stop laughing. She thought her still more comical looking when she began to run. But the laugh now turned to grief, for the old witch pulled some strong leather straps out of her pocket, and, fastening them round the brother and sister, she drove them back into the house. There she shut them up in a lean-to, and secured them firmly with another strap to 2 strong wooden posts. The children at first were terribly frightened when they found they could not get away, and Ingibjorg blamed herself greatly for having, through her foolish laughter, brought about this terrible pass. But the old woman evidently did not mean to starve them, for presently she placed a big bowl of bread and milk before each of them, saying, "Now eat all you can, and don't waste anything." In the evening she again brought them food in plenty, and this went on for some days. But, though they were not harshly treated, except that they were never untied, the children grew very weary and tired. The room was almost dark, the only light coming through the hole in the roof, which also served as a chimney. On the 3rd day, the old woman took one of each of their hands, and mumbling and gently biting their fingers, she muttered, "No, no, not fat enough yet." Thorwald, therefore, determined to make every effort in order to free themselves, but this was no easy matter. At length, after many attempts, he succeeded in biting through the strap that fastened his hands. He was thus able to get at his hunting knife, which he fortunately always wore beneath his tunic, so the old woman had not seen it, else she would certainly have taken it away. Then, waiting till night closed in and the old witch was asleep, he cut through the rest of the straps that bound him and his sister. "But the old woman will run after us and catch us if she sees us," whispered Ingibjorg. "I have thought of that too," replied Thorwald. "We must, therefore, make sure she is asleep." And, creeping cautiously along the floor, he bent over the old hag, who lay snoring in one corner on a great heap of skins. "She is sound," he then whispered, turning to Ingibjorg, having first carefully placed another thick skin over the old woman. "We must get away ere she wakens. Come, sister, don't delay." And, taking Ingibjorg by the hand, he hurried her out of the house. "Now you wait behind that great stone," said he, "while I cut and widen this ditch which runs across the road." Then Thorwald set energetically to work with his hunting knife, and ere long had cut a deep, wide ditch, throwing up the loose earth to form a bank, which rose up between them and the hut. By this time the old ogress had wakened up, and, not hearing a sound, began feeling about for the children. When she had tapped all round and could not find them, she began to scream and swear with rage, and ran out, calling loudly after them. As soon as Ingibjorg saw her rushing along, her hair streaming wildly behind her, she could not help laughing out aloud. "Ha! So you are there, you bad, wicked children," cried the ogress. "But only wait, just let me catch you, and I will teach you to run away. You shall be put into the oven at once, for you are quite fat enough now, and then I shall have a good meal." So saying, she ran along the path to where she heard Ingibjorg's voice, but, unable to see the ditch, she fell in headlong and broke her neck. Thorwald did not wait to learn what happened, but as soon as he saw the ogress run after them and fall into the ditch, he took hold of Ingibjorg's hand, and together they raced back to the shore, very thankful that they were now safe from the old witch's clutches. Chapter 4. The King's Return, and Queen Guda's release from the witch's thrall. Several weeks now passed. Each morning, Thorwald first gave a look across the sea in hopes of seeing a ship or boat, and would then start off in search of birds and game, while, strangely enough, after the old witch's death, their fire never went out, and Ingibjorg, by carefully attending to it, was able to keep it burning both day and night. Sometimes, when no food was needed, the children having laid in a sufficient supply of game and fish, Thorwald would take his flute and play, while his sister plaited mats and baskets out of the long rushes that grew near the shore. Thus it happened that one day, while the two children sat on the shore, they saw several ships sailing slowly past the island. Thorwald, who had just put down his flute, now took it up again, and began playing as loud as he could. The ships came gradually nearer. "Oh, Thorwald," cried Ingibjorg, clapping her hands, "see, they are coming nearer. Oh, play louder, louder." And she joined her voice to his flute. And sure enough, ere long, the largest of the vessels cast anchor close to the shore, the other ships still keeping out to sea at some distance. And then, to the children's great joy, they saw their father standing on the deck. A boat was lowered. The king and one of his followers were quickly rowed to shore, and in a few more moments Thorwald and Ingibjorg were clasped in their father's arms. Great was his surprise to find them on this lonely island, for he had heard nothing of what had happened in his own country during his absence, and it was only by chance that he had sailed close to the island, none of his people caring to come near it, as it was supposed to be the home of evil spirits. And when they heard the sound of the flute, they thought it must surely be the song of some mermaids, wiling the king's fleet to destruction by their soft, sweet melodies. But the king, for some reason, felt he must find out what it was, so had ventured near the land, the rest of his fleet keeping out to sea. The king then asked his children how it was they were there, and when he heard what had happened during his absence, he grew very wroth. He at once took the children on board his own ship, and commanded his people under pain of instant death not to breathe a word to any one of what had occurred. The fleet was then ordered to set sail and return home with all possible speed. Arrived near his own island, the king chose a quiet and retired part of the shore, and there he landed the children in charge of his own attendant, telling him to keep them hidden till he sent him word to appear with them at court. The fleet then departed and cast anchor at the usual landing place. Here the queen, arrayed in her richest garments and attended by all her maidens, came down to welcome the king, expressing great joy at his return. The king appeared well pleased to be at home again. "But where are the children?" he asked, "and why have they not come to meet me, as they always do?" "Alas, alas!" cried the queen, putting her handkerchief to her eyes as if to hide her tears, but really because she was afraid to look at the king. "Poor, poor children! Pray do not speak of them." Soon after you went away, they suddenly got very ill, and though I watched and nursed them myself, the poor little things both died. And Gouda began to sob and cry in reality, for she greatly feared what the king might do if he ever heard the truth. And no one dared say a word, for during the king's absence, Gouda, urged on by fear of her mother if she did not get rid of her stepchildren, and also thinking that she could only govern by making herself feared, had ruled the kingdom with great severity, so no one dared say a word against her, believing that the king was still devoted to her. The king, wishing to get at the truth of the strange tale, pretended great sorrow at the news of the children's death. "And where are the poor little things buried?" he asked. "I should like to see their tomb." The queen tried to persuade him not to go. She said she was sure it would only increase his sorrow, and entreated him to desist. But the more she urged him not to go, the more determined he was to see their tomb. So at length Gouda yielded, and herself accompanied him to the wood at the back of the palace, where, in a pretty open glade, she had caused a handsome mausoleum to be erected. He greatly admired the beautiful carving on the stone, but he never shed a tear, which somewhat surprised the queen. Soon after, they both returned to the palace, where the queen had had a banquet prepared to welcome home the travellers. All during the feast, the king still remained very silent and preoccupied, and next morning he again went to the mausoleum, and then said he meant to have the children's coffins taken out. When the queen heard this, she threw herself on her knees before the king, and begged and entreated him not to thus further increase his pain and grief. But the king remained firm. The door of the great mausoleum was thrown back, and two small coffins, handsomely ornamented with gold and silver, were brought forth. But, behold, when at the king's order these were opened, instead of containing the bodies of the two children, they were filled up with stones. The queen gave a great cry when she saw her wickedness had come to light. She fell down at the king's feet, and, sobbing and praying for mercy, she confessed what she had done, adding that her mother, the old witch, had forced her to do it. But the king was so angry that he would not listen to her words, and ordered her to be shut up in the castle donjon till the Volkthing decided what her punishment should be. Meanwhile, Thorwald and Ingibjorg arrived at the palace, the king having sent a messenger for them, and great was the rejoicing among the people when they learnt their young prince and princess, whom they thought dead, were alive, and once again among them all. The children then told their story before the assembled nobles and Vikings, and when Ingibjorg related how Thorwald had killed the old ogress, who had only been fattening them up in order to eat them, there was a flash of lightning, and a loud crash of thunder resounded through the great hall. The door at the lower end opened, and, to the surprise of everyone, the queen, draped in a long, glistening white robe, walked up the hall, and falling down at the king's feet, she raised her clasped hands towards him. "Pardon and forgiveness, O king," she cried. "The spell that has nearly cost me my life is at length broken. That terrible old ogress was not my mother, but a wicked fairy who, because she thought my mother had not treated her as well as the other fairies at my christening, condemned me as soon as my mother died, to serve her and obey all her behests as long as she lived. Now that your brave boy has killed her, I am freed from her wicked spells. And now, O my king, punish me for the harm I have so unwillingly done, but, oh, let me live to prove my gratitude to you and yours." Great was the surprise of everyone at the Queen's story, and the ambassadors then recalled to mind how silent and grave the young Queen had been when they first saw her, even while she did all the old witch ordered her to do. Thorwald also added his entreaties to those of the Queen, and when Ingibjorg with a merry laugh threw one arm round her father and the other round the Queen, the King relented. And thereupon the interrupted feast was renewed amid general rejoicing, the Queen seated at the King's right hand with Thorwald beside her, and Ingibjorg on his left hand. There was no happier family in all the land. Queen Gudar, having no children of her own, lavished all her affection on Thorwald and Ingibjorg, whose entreaties had restored her to her husband, and the reign of the King and Queen Gudar was ever after cited as one of the longest and happiest ever known. The Three Peasant, Maidens. Chapter 1. Truda and Hertha. Alitair and Truda were both fine, handsome girls, but Hertha, the youngest, was by far the loveliest of the three. Their house was not far from the king's palace, and one day, when the three sisters were out walking, they met the king, attended by his secretary and his valet. "Ah," sighed Alitair, the eldest sister, "how happy I should be if I could only marry the king's valet. I should then be able to see all the grand feasts that are held at the palace." "And I should like to marry his secretary," murmured Truda, the second sister, "for then I should both hear and see all that was going on." "Oh, if I had to marry anyone," cried Hertha, the youngest sister, "I should like to marry King Leofric himself. See how young and handsome he is." The king, who had noticed the whispers and eager glances of the girls, said to his attendants, "I wonder what those pretty maidens want. Let us go to them and find out what they are talking about. I thought I heard them mention my name." The secretary tried to dissuade the young king from speaking to the girls, saying he was sure their chatter was not worth listening to, and that his majesty had better not attend to them. But King Leofric would not be put off, and it ended in their all three going up to the young maidens. Then the king asked them what they had been talking about when he and his attendants came in sight. Now when the girls saw the king come up to them, they were rather frightened, but he spoke so kindly and pleasantly that their fears soon vanished, and when he insisted on hearing what they had said, they at last confessed the truth. King Leofric was mightily amused when he heard their tale. He thought the girls very handsome, especially the youngest one, and after chatting with them for some little time, he found them so bright and clever that he told them their wishes should be fulfilled. The sisters were so surprised to think their idle words should speedily become real facts that they were speechless with wonder and delight. So the king and his two attendants escorted the girls back to their home, where the father's pride may be imagined when he heard who the suitors were. Of course he threw no difficulties in the way, and as the king's wishes were law, all three maidens were shortly married, each to the man of her choice. Now, although Alitair and Truda would have been quite satisfied with their choice had Hertha not become queen, no sooner did they realize how much grander was her lot than theirs, than they became very jealous of her. And though she did her best to be friends with them, giving them handsome presents and taking them everywhere with her, their envy only grew stronger, till at last they determined that, no matter at what cost. She must be brought down from her high estate. So they plotted and planned for many a long hour how they could best get her out of the way. At the end of a year, the queen had a little son. Then her sisters took away the baby in the night and arranged that it should be cast into the deep ditch outside the city walls, where all the rubbish was thrown. But the old woman who had undertaken to do this thought she would give the poor babe a chance for its life. So, instead of throwing it in the ditch, she placed it on the bank, hoping that some kind person passing might see it and take it away. And this actually did happen, for Osric, a poor old woodcutter, on his way home, seeing the pretty babe lying there crying helplessly, took it up in his arms. "This is a strange thing," he said. "Someone surely must have put it here purposely, but I cannot leave the poor bairn crying here." So saying, he carefully wrapped it in his old coat and took it home, where he fed it as best he could. When next morning it was found that the baby had disappeared, the sisters told the king they were sure that the queen must have put away or killed the child, but though King Leofric was greatly grieved at the loss of his little son, he loved his wife too dearly to blame her for the child's disappearance. The next year the queen again had a baby boy, and the news caused great rejoicings all through the kingdom. But that same night this child also disappeared, and the two sisters again told the king that they were sure the queen had caused it to be killed. But King Leofric, though startled and grieved at these strange disappearances of his children, still trusted his wife and would not hear a word against her. The following year, greatly to the king's delight, the queen had a baby girl. "Surely," she thought, "this time nothing shall come between me and my baby." So she would not let the little creature out of her arms day or night. But she was weak and ill, and the second night, seeing she would not lay down the child, the wicked sisters gave her a sleeping draught, and as soon as her eyelids closed, they again took away the babe and gave it to the old woman to throw into the ditch. When next morning the king heard that his little daughter, at whose birth he had so rejoiced, had also disappeared, his grief and anger knew no bounds. They quite overcame his former love for his wife. He would listen to no excuses, and ordered her to be thrown into the den of the big lion. When the wicked sisters heard this, they thought they had now got rid of Queen Hertha. They were quite pleased to think they had at last succeeded in the wicked plot they had planned, without the king or anyone else ever suspecting the part they had taken in it. Chapter 2. What had befallen the two little princes and their sister? But Queen Hertha was not dead, for the lion, so far from hurting her, laid himself quietly down at her feet, and when his food was brought to him, he would never touch it till the queen had taken her share. So, while everyone thought she was dead, Queen Hertha lived beside her powerful friend. At first she had been terribly frightened, but she speedily grew almost to love the huge beast, who, when the king and her sisters had been so cruel, had befriended her in her hour of need. Still, it was at best but a dreary existence, and many times, and often she wished she could but know what was happening outside the lion's den. As for the children, the same old man, Osric, who had picked up the first baby, had fortunately also found the other boy and the baby girl, and had taken them home to his own little cot near the woods, where he brought them up as well as he could. He called the elder boy Wilhelm, the second one Sigurd, and the little baby girl Olga. He had tried at first to find out whose children they could possibly be, but one night he dreamed that a beautiful fairy came to his bedside and said, "Osric, if you love the children, don't ask any questions about them, but bring them up as your own. Their enemies will else destroy them. Let them wait till they are grown up." So he had kept his own counsel and did the best he could for them. Strangely enough, too, he found that his barrel of meal never ran short, and, with his cow and his little patch of garden ground, they always had a sufficiency of food. So the children grew up strong and healthy, the boys helping the old man in his forest work and fetching the wood and water that was wanted, and as for Olga, she soon became quite an expert little housekeeper. But though they wore rough, homespun garments, they were good to look at, for they all three inherited the marvelous beauty of their father and mother. At last, when the young people were grown up, the old man, feeling his end draw near, called Olga and her brothers to his bedside. He then told them how and where he had found them, and also mentioned the strange vision he had had. "But now that you are grown up," he added, "I should advise you to make all inquiries, and not to rest till you have found out who and what you are, for I feel sure you are no ordinary children." Thereupon he gave them his blessing and died. Wilhelm, Sigurd, and Olga sorrowed deeply over the death of their kind foster father, for they had loved him dearly. When they had buried him in the forest, they returned sadly to the empty hut and consulted together as to what they had best do in order to carry out his instructions. While they were thus sitting and talking, the door of the hut opened, and an old man entered. He was dressed entirely in green, his hair was long and white, so also was his beard, and in his hand he carried a thick oaken staff. "Good morrow, father," said Wilhelm. "You are welcome, though we have not much to offer you. Pray take a seat and rest, for you look weary." "I have come a long way, my son," answered the old man, "but though I am still hale and hearty, I shall not be sorry for a short rest. But you seem in sorrow or trouble," he added, looking from one to the other. "Perhaps I might be able to help you, for I have travelled far and seen many strange and wonderful things." "We shall indeed be glad of some advice," said Sigurd, while Olga hastened to place a bowl of new milk and some oatcakes before the traveller. "Sir, we are sadly perplexed as to what we ought to do." And the brothers then proceeded to tell the stranger their story and the advice their foster father had given them. When he had heard their strange tale, the old man said, "I fear I cannot help you myself, but I think I know someone who may be able to advise you. You must know that about 3 days' journey from here, there lies a valley full of strangely shaped stones. In the middle of this valley there is a rock on which a large bird sits who is very wise, and understands and speaks the human language. Now, I think you should go and see this bird, though I will not conceal from you that there is very great danger attending such a visit. Many people have gone to consult him, but so far no one has ever returned. He is, however, so wise that he can both foretell the future and also reveal the past. Many princes and others have gone for advice to this wonderful bird, but one and all have failed in carrying out the conditions which can alone ensure success. You must know that whoever mounts the rock on which the bird sits must be so brave and have such strength of will that, no matter what he may see or hear, he must not turn round or look back, for if he does, even for only a second, he will at once be turned into stone. So far, no one yet has possessed the required purpose and unswerving staunchness," continued the old man. "But it is not difficult to mount the rock, provided you have the necessary determination. Then, when you have mounted, you will have the power to restore to life all those who, through lack of will and strength of purpose, were turned into stone. For on the summit of the rock there is a huge jar filled with magic water, and he who safely reaches the summit may take some of this water and sprinkle it over those who have been turned to stone. They will then awake to life and regain their form and figure." Both brothers thought the task by no means a difficult one, and declared themselves quite ready and willing to undertake the journey. They thanked the old man heartily for all his information and advice, and then sped him on his journey. Next morning, Wilhelm said to Sigurd that he would start forth in search of the rock. But before he left, he said to his brother, "If at any time you see 3 drops of blood on your knife when you are at dinner, you must get up and follow me, for you will then know that I have failed and have been turned to stone, and that you must then try your best." So Wilhelm went forth, followed by the good wishes of Sigurd and Olga. But after 3 days, when the brother and sister sat down to dinner, behold, 3 drops of blood were on the blade of Sigurd's knife. Hastily starting up, he told Olga he must be off at once in search of their brother. "And remember, Olga, though I hope I may be successful, if at the end of 3 days you see 3 drops of blood on your knife, you will know that I too have failed." He then bade her a loving farewell, and Olga saw him start on his way, with many fears and prayers in her heart for his safety. Chapter 3. Ónigas. Courage rescues Hare brothers. Queen Heth is restored to her husband, and the parents recover their children. It seemed to Olga as if the time would never pass. Each day seemed longer than the last, and when the morning of the 3rd day arrived, she had scarcely courage to look at her knife as she sat down to her breakfast. But, oh joy! The blade was bright and clear, and with a light and happy heart she went about her daily tasks. When midday approached, she again glanced anxiously at the table, but, to her intense relief, the knife beside her plate was undimmed by either spot or stain, and feeling as if a great weight had been lifted off her, she sat down to her spinning wheel, which she had not had the heart to do before, and hummed one of her favourite ballads, to drive away the feeling of loneliness that crept over her. And thus the hours passed. Then, as the long, slanting rays of the sun warned her that the day was nearly over, Olga put away her spinning wheel and got ready her supper. She had placed her plate of porridge on the table, and, bringing a bowl of milk from the cupboard, had just seated herself, when, glancing down, she saw 3 bright crimson drops on the knife beside her plate. With a cry of grief and horror, Olga sprang up. There was now no thought of food or rest. Not a second must be lost if she hoped to save her brothers. Hastily putting on her cloak and hood, she hurried out into the forest, following the path she had seen her brothers take. Evening was closing in, and the tall trees cast dark and weird shadows around her. But never for a moment did Olga hesitate or rest. Strange, uncouth sounds seemed to fill the air, and she could almost fancy that the clinging brushwood which often crossed her path seemed like long arms trying to hold her back. But she had only one thought, one resolve, the rescue of her brothers, so she kept bravely on, putting aside every obstacle that obstructed her way. At length, after a long and weary journey, Olga arrived at the valley in which stood the great rock. As she came near, she saw that the whole ground was covered with innumerable stones of quaint and varied forms. Some looked like people, some like animals, and one tall figure had several square stones at his feet, like chests or boxes. But Olga, though her heart almost jumped into her mouth at the wild, weird scene, walked courageously forward, turning neither to the right nor left, till she reached the rock on which sat the bird, his crest raised fiercely, while angry flashes of light from his eyes almost blinded her. No sooner, however, had her foot touched it, than a loud rumbling noise arose. Wild cries and screams filled the air. Thunder pealed, and flash after flash of lightning filled the valley with a lurid light. Strong arms caught hold of her and tried to keep her back, while entreaties for help sounded on every side. Once, indeed, she distinctly heard her brothers' voices, praying her to look round if she loved them. Steadfastly, however, With a prayer on her lips for strength and guidance, Olga went bravely up the rock. No sooner had she reached the summit than immediately the thunder and lightning ceased. The weird cries and screams were silent, and, as she approached the great bird, he lowered his angry crest, and in a soft voice praised her for her courage and steadfastness. "I can now tell you whatever you desire, and will gladly help you in any way you wish," he added. Then Olga asked that she might first of all be allowed to restore to life all those who had been turned to stone. This the bird readily granted, and, filling the lid of the stone jar with some of the life-restoring water, Olga lost no time in sprinkling all the strangely shaped stones with the magic water. They all immediately regained their natural forms. The still and silent valley soon re-echoed with the sound of voices, and as the girl stood there between her two rescued brothers, all the others came up to thank the fair and brave maiden whose courage and steadfastness had rescued them from their stony prison and restored them to life. "And now," said Olga, turning again to the wonderful bird, "can you tell us whose children we are?" "You are the children of the king of this country," he replied, and then proceeded to tell them how the two wicked aunts, through jealousy, had caused them to be carried away, and had then accused their mother of destroying them, for which supposed misdeed she had been thrown into the lion's den. "But," he added, seeing the grief and horror of the young people, "the lion's mouth was closed, so that, instead of killing her, he not only shares his food with her, but has so guarded the cage that no one dares enter. She is still alive, therefore, though almost at death's door through grief and all the anxiety she has endured." Then one of the strange figures who had been restored to life, and whom Olga had especially noticed as being taller and fairer than most of the others, and also because he was surrounded with several quaintly shaped chests, now came forward. He was a handsome young fellow, and stated that he was called Odo, and was the son of a neighbouring king, and that, having gone forth in search of treasure and adventures, he had succeeded in amassing a large quantity of gold and precious stones, and was on his way home when he heard of the wonderful bird who could foretell the future. He had gained the valley and was almost close to the bird when he incautiously looked back, hearing wild cries for help, and in that moment he had been turned to stone, and his were the quaintly shaped chests Olga had noticed. The bird, being in a gracious mood, allowed the prince to carry away his treasure, so, followed by his servants, he accompanied Olga and her brothers to their home. As soon as they arrived, they at once went to the lion's den and liberated the poor queen, the lion offering no resistance, and took her back to their hut. Poor Hertha was almost dead with grief and anxiety, but loving care quickly restored her to health, and the delight of seeing her dear children, whom she had thought dead, alive and well before her, did more than anything to restore her and make her strong and well. They then procured her some rich and fitting garments, and leaving her in the hut, they repaired to the king's court and demanded an audience. After some little delay, this was granted, for after the loss of his wife and children, the king had grown sad and listless, often blaming himself for condemning his queen so hurriedly, for, when he had time to think it all over, he could not, despite her sister's repeated representations, believe that the queen had really killed her children. When the sister and brothers were ushered into the royal presence, the king was at once struck by their noble appearance, especially with Olga, whose likeness to her mother was marvellous. They then told him who they were and how they had been saved, and also that they had just freed their mother, who was not dead as he had been told. King Leofric could scarcely believe he heard aright, as they related their wonderful tale, the particulars of which they had received from the magic bird, and it is impossible to describe his delight and thankfulness to find that his wife, whom he had loved so dearly, was not only proved innocent, but was alive and well. He immediately sent for her two wicked sisters, and when questioned as to what they had done, they began first to prevaricate, and then each accused the other of having done the wicked deed. But the truth was clearly proved against them. They were therefore both thrown into the lion's den, where the poor queen had so long lingered. This time, however, the lion never hesitated, but eat them both up at once. The king then eagerly went to fetch his queen, who returned to the palace with all due honours and splendour. A great feast was immediately prepared to celebrate the happy restoration of the lost queen and her 3 children. This feast lasted many days, for all who chose to come were welcome. Indeed, it seemed as if the king could not do enough to show how thankful he was. He remitted the sentences of many state prisoners, and all the poor in the kingdom received rich gifts. When at length the feast came to an end, Prince Odo asked the king for the hand of his daughter, the fair Princess Olga. Thereupon a fresh feast was arranged to celebrate the marriage of the prince and princess, and this was carried out with still greater splendour, such as had never been seen before. Not only was the big hall of the palace prepared for the invited guests, but endless tables were spread in the great courtyard for all the poor and homeless, to whom abundant good fare was generously dispensed, for, Princess Olga said, as they had been poor themselves, they must never forget their less fortunate subjects. Then, when it was over, Prince Odo returned to his own kingdom with his wife, where they reigned in peace and happiness for many years. Wilhelm married a beautiful cousin and succeeded to the throne at his father's death. Sigurd also married a lovely princess in a neighbouring state and came to the throne on the death of his father-in-law. Thus Olga and her brothers, after all their trials, lived long and happily, their children and children's children reigning after them for many generations. The Fair and the Dark. Isold. Chapter 1. Death of the Queen. The king remarries and proceeds on a tour through his kingdom. There once reigned a king and queen, and they had one little daughter called Isolde. She was the loveliest little maiden ever seen. Her skin was white as the driven snow. Her cheeks looked as if pink rose petals had fallen on them. Her lips were the colour of the reddest cherries, and the deepest blue of the summer sky seemed reflected in her eyes, while her long fair hair, reaching almost down to the ground, glistened like gold when touched by the sun's rays. Having no son of his own, the king had adopted his nephew Fertram as his heir to the crown. The boy was as handsome as the little girl was lovely, and his father and mother being both dead, he was brought up at his uncle's court. He was 2 years older than Isolde, but the children were devoted to each other, and the parents often looked forward to the time when they would be old enough to be betrothed and married. But the truth of the old saying, "The best laid plans of mice and men gang aft agley," was once again to be verified. For when Isolde and Fertram were respectively 16 and 18, and there was talk of a great betrothal feast shortly, the good queen, who had gone out bathing in the sea on a raw autumn morning, took a severe chill and shortly after died. The king was quite inconsolable at her loss, and after her funeral he shut himself up in his rooms for many months and would see no one but Fertram and Isolde. Even when at length he again came forth, he seemed to take no interest in anything. Gradually matters grew worse and worse, till at last the chief officers of the court came to him and advised him to marry again. For a long time the king would not listen to them, but at length, wearied out with their importunities, he said they might go and see if they could find anyone worthy to succeed his late queen. So some ships were fitted out, and the chief officers started forth on their quest. They sailed on for many days without seeing any land, but at length they saw some rising ground on the horizon, which, as they came nearer, proved to be a rocky island surrounded by a low sandy beach. Here the men landed, and following a narrow road which led them up a thickly wooded valley, they presently arrived at the gates of a fine castle. They looked to see if the warden was there, for the drawbridge was down, but no one was on the walls, so they crossed the bridge and blew the horn which hung near the gateway. Immediately the great doors flew open, and they entered. Still there was no one about, so they walked up a wide flight of stairs, and presently they came out on a broad terrace. Here a handsome, tall, and stately woman, dressed all in black, came forward and bade them welcome. She then clapped her hands, and a pretty dark-haired maiden appeared, bearing a silver tray with flagons of rich wine and fruit. The ministers were invited to sit down on one of the big stone benches, and while they were partaking of the fruit and wine, which was very welcome after their long walk, the lady told them that her husband had died in battle, most of his followers having also been killed, and that she was now living there alone with her daughter. Then she brought out her lute, and sang to the men while they rested, and entertained them so well that they all agreed they need go no further to seek a lady worthy to fill the late queen's place. So they forthwith solicited her hand for their master the king. At first the queen said she could not think of accepting the offer, for that she had made up her mind, after her dear husband's death, to live and die in his now deserted castle. But the more reluctant she appeared, the king's ambassadors only grew the more urgent, until at length she consented to go with them. Handing over the castle and all it contained to an old servant, she and her daughter departed with the king's people, and, the wind being favourable, the homeward journey did not take many days to accomplish. When the king saw the ships in the distance, all decorated with flags and gaily coloured banners, he knew that the ministers must have been successful in their quest, so he ordered out his golden chariot, and, accompanied by all his chief courtiers, drove down to the shore, there to await the travellers. At length the vessels were beached, and no sooner had the king set eyes on his bride than he at once felt a great love for her in his heart. He placed her beside him in his golden chariot, while her daughter and the attendants followed in a silver one, and thus they proceeded back to the palace, where a great feast had been prepared, at which all the great princes and nobles of the land were present. The rejoicings continued for a whole week. Wine and mead were lavishly dispensed to all who came, and the tables literally groaned beneath the great dishes of fish, flesh, and fowl, interspersed with huge pyramids of delicate cakes and delicious fruits. At the end of the feast, each guest was presented with valuable gifts from the king's treasure house, so that all those who were poor when they came returned home rich and happy, while the queen herself was invested with all the grandeur and power of her new position. Strangely enough, the new queen's daughter was called Isolde, like the king's daughter, but, though the former was very pretty, everyone declared she could not compare with the latter. So, in order to distinguish them, the former was always spoken of as Dark Isolde, and the latter Fair Isolde. Now Isolde, the king's daughter, did not live in the palace, for her father, on her 16th birthday, had built her a separate tower standing in the midst of a beautiful garden. It was fitted up with every possible luxury and convenience. Rich curtains draped all the windows, soft couches, covered with dainty silks and cushions of cloth of gold, lined the walls, and bright carpets were spread on the inlaid, polished floors. Here Isolde spent her days very pleasantly with her two favourite attendants, Ea and Mea, spinning and weaving and gathering flowers to deck her rooms, and here Fertram would often join her, after one of their long rides in the forest, chatting and laughing and making happy plans for their future. Soon after the king's second wedding, the queen came to him one day, and, after praising his kind rule over his people, told him she thought he ought not to remain longer at home with her, but make a tour and visit all his provinces to see what the governors were doing and whether they were getting in the treasure rightly. The king, who was very happy and comfortable at home, did not at first agree to this, but the queen at last managed to persuade him and also advised him to take Fertram with him, saying that it was only right he should see something of the world and of the kingdom over which he was one day to rule. So, at length, the king yielded and ordered his ships to be got ready, at the same time telling Fertram that he was to accompany him. Though pleased at the thought of the journey, Fertram was grieved to leave fair Isolde, and the parting between them was a very sad one, for both felt that some misfortune was hanging over them, and yet they could not tell what. A few days later, the king and Fertram sailed away amid great cheering of the people, who crowded down to the shore to wish the travellers good speed on their journey and a quick and happy return. Chapter 2. What befalls Fair? Isold, after her father has gone. Isolde the Fair felt terribly sad and lonely after her father's and Fertram's departure. She lost all interest in her work and play, and would sit for hours at one of the windows facing the sea, ever hoping to see the welcome sight of the returning ships. At last, one morning, about a fortnight after the king had gone, the queen came to her, and, greeting her kindly, asked her to come with her and her daughter dark Isolde and spend the day in the woods. "I know a lovely spot," she added, "where we can have a splendid game of ball, and then, when we are tired, we can sit down and rest and dine beneath the shade of the trees." Fair Isolde at first refused, saying she did not feel as if she cared to play, but the queen would take no denial, and at last Isolde, who had been very lonely since Fertram went away, agreed to go, together with her two maidens, Ea and Mea. It was a fine bright morning as the whole party set forth, and the sun and the fresh air soon made Isolde feel more like her former self. Laughing and singing, the whole party wandered merrily through the woods till they reached a lovely open glade, when they commenced a merry game. Here, there, and everywhere flew the bright-coloured balls, tossed and caught by eager hands. Isolde the Fair was more deft in her play than the others, and never missed a ball, but further and even further flew the balls sent by the queen and her daughter, till at length they and fair Isolde were quite out of sight of their attendants, when the latter, running swiftly after a bright crimson ball, suddenly paused, for at her feet there yawned a deep, dark pit. "Oh, stop!" she cried, startled, looking round at the queen and dark Isolde. "Stop! Don't come any further, or you will fall into this dreadful place." But the words had scarcely passed her lips when she felt a strong push and fell headlong into the hole. Then the queen, laughing wickedly, looked down at poor Isolde and said, "Ha! Ha, my pretty bird! How do you like your new house, fair Isolde? It is not quite so fine as your grand, beautiful tower, is it? But you won't need such pretty things now, for you will soon be dead, and then Fertram, on his return, will marry my dark Isolde. Oh, help me out! Don't leave me here," cried fair Isolde, "and I will promise, on the word of a princess, never to speak of this to anyone." "No, no, my young damsel. Promises are easily broken, but the dead tell no tales." And, despite her tears and entreaties, the wicked queen and her daughter placed branches of pine trees across the open pit, and then covered them thickly with earth and leaves, so that no one, even if they passed that way, would ever dream there was a grave hidden beneath. By this time the sun had set, and it was getting dusk ere they had finished their task, so the queen and dark Isolde hastened back to the palace. But ere they entered it, they set fire to fair Isolde's tower, which was soon completely burnt to the ground. The queen's attendants, meanwhile, together with Ea and Mea, finding the queen and the two princesses did not return, called out and searched for them in various directions, but, seeing nothing of them, concluded they had returned to the palace, and so, as it was now quite dark, hastened home themselves. On their arrival there, they found the queen and dark Isolde, who said fair Isolde had returned with them back to her tower, saying she was tired, when shortly after, to their horror, they had noticed flames bursting out of the windows, but ere they could send help, the tower was burnt down. Poor Aya and Meya were inconsolable at the loss of their beloved mistress, and mourned long and sadly for her. Chapter 3. Fair Isold escapes and disguises herself. We must now return to fair Isolde. When she heard the queen's words and knew that they did not mean to help her, but intended leaving her there to die, she wept long and bitterly. Then, as hour after hour passed, and, though she listened intently, she could hear no one passing by who might have helped her, she sat down on a heap of leaves lying in one corner, and began to think how best she could get out. Then she suddenly remembered that she had fortunately that morning put on the golden girdle which had been a parting gift of her mother on her deathbed, and to which was attached a large pair of golden scissors. She had enjoined fair Isolde never to go outside the house without this girdle, for it had been given her by a fairy godmother, and had the marvellous power of preserving whoever wore it both from hunger and fatigue. Isolde, therefore, after her first burst of grief, felt she was not quite helpless. The power of the girdle would save her from starvation, till she could once again procure food. And meanwhile, feeling somewhat comforted, she took hold of the big golden scissors, and by working hard, and persevering in spite of fatigue, she managed to dig some deep holes in the side of the pit, large enough to give her a good foothold, and thus managed to climb up to the top and work her way through the mass of earth and leaves the wicked queen and her daughter had piled up together. When she at last got out, she wandered about the forest for some time till she got back to the open glade where they had played ball. Here she sat down to consider what she had better do. At first she thought it would be safer to keep hidden away in the forest, for fear her stepmother might find her and again try to kill her. But on second thoughts, she decided it would be better for her to return to the tower, and so disguise herself that no one could possibly recognize her. She first stained her face brown with the juice of some berries, and then with her deft fingers she made herself a quaint dress and large cap out of various coloured leaves, and thus disguised she went back to her tower and found it a heap of ashes. Feeling now certain there was a plot against her, she determined to go on to the palace, went round to the kitchen door and begged the cook to give her a morsel of food, as she was very hungry. The cook, who was a kind-hearted old woman, told her to sit down on a bench and fetched her some bread and meat, in return for which Isolde offered to mend her clothes for her, as she probably had no time to do so herself, saying her name was Nefra, the sewing girl. The old cook, who, although good at her own work, was no great hand with her needle, was delighted when she heard this, and told her she was welcome to stay as long as she liked, more especially as the king would soon be back, when there would be plenty of work for everyone. So Nefra remained, and when it was seen how clever she was with her needle, she found plenty to do, for the whole king's household declared they had never seen such beautiful work as hers. Chapter 4. Fertram falls under a spell, and is betrothed to dark Isold. At length the king returned from his long tour, accompanied by Fertram, and as soon as the ships were in sight, the queen and her daughter drove down to the shore to welcome them home. When they were all four seated in the golden chariot on their way back to the palace, both the king and Fertram were greatly surprised not to see fair Isolde, and asked why she had not come down to meet them. Then the queen, pretending to weep, and putting her handkerchief to her eyes, said that some time after the king's departure, the tower in which Isolde lived had been burned to the ground. No one could find out how the accident had happened, but they thought the princess must have carelessly left a light near some of the curtains. This terrible calamity was a fearful blow to Fertram, so, instead of joining in the festivities to celebrate the king's return, he shut himself up in his own rooms and would see no one for several weeks. At last the queen herself came to his door, and as she would take no denial, he was at length obliged to open it. When she entered, he saw she held a golden goblet in her hand filled with wine. At first he would have none of it, but as she continued to press and urge him, if only just to taste it, hoping by so doing to get rid of her, Fertram took the cup and drank a little. But no sooner had he swallowed the first mouthful than he fell into a deep sleep and lost all consciousness. When at last he awakened, all remembrance of his love for fair Isolde had vanished. The queen, seeing the satisfactory effect of her magic draught, lost no time in sounding the praises of her own daughter, until at length, after much persuasion, Fertram consented to marry her, and a day was fixed for the wedding. Ere this could take place, however, the future bride had, according to the custom of the country, to embroider and make up both her own and the bridegroom's wedding garments. Now, dark Isolde was not good with her needle. She was very lazy, and much preferred idling about and gossiping in the stables and kennels to sewing or spinning indoors. In her perplexity as to what she had better do, for she wanted to marry Fertram, she sauntered across the stable-yard to the kitchen, where the old cook was sitting on a stool shelling peas, and asked her what she would advise her to do. "You ought to be ashamed of yourself to be so helpless," answered the cook crossly, for she had no love for the new queen and her daughter. "It is all very well for a poor old woman like me not to be able to use her needle, for I have always had to work hard for my living, and my hands soon got too rough for sewing much. But for a young princess like you not to be able to embroider her own wedding dress, why, such a disgrace will be handed down for generations. But there, as you are so stupid, I suppose I must try and help you. Fortunately, there is a young girl here, called Nefracolla, who sews as beautifully as any princess. You tell her I sent you, and I dare say she will help you." When dark Isolde heard this, she was greatly pleased, and at once ran up to her room and brought down the various pieces of silk and twists of gold and silver thread, and brought them to Nefracolla, begging her to make up the garments. This Nefracolla promised to do, and her clever busy fingers finished both the bridal garments the evening before the wedding. Chapter 1. The spell is broken, and the wicked queen's designs are frustrated. The following morning the sun shone out bright and clear, and everyone declared no happier omen could usher in so auspicious a day. But when the queen went to her daughter's room to waken her, in place of dark Isolde, there lay a hideous dwarf in the bed. "Oh, Isolde!" cried the queen, wringing her hands. "What can we do? How was it possible that we both forgot that this is the one morning in the year on which you must resume your own form? Oh, this is terrible. We must put off the wedding and say that you are ill." "No, no," croaked the misshapen figure. "If we once let Fertram off, I know he will never marry me." The queen remained lost in thought for a few minutes. Then she exclaimed, "I know what we will do. I will get Nefracolla, the sewing girl. She is just your height and size. I will dress her as the bride, and under the thickly embroidered veil no one will notice the difference. Then, after the whole party come back from their ride, you will have resumed your own pretty face and figure. You can then change with Nefracolla, and none will be any the wiser." "But will not Nefracolla talk about it or object?" asked the dwarf. "Neither she herself nor anyone else will know anything about it," replied the queen. "You leave it all to me." In a short time, the queen went to Nefracola's room and brought her a hot cup of coffee. "Drink this," she said. "I am sure you must be wearied out with all the work you have done, and this will be a tiring day for you." Though Nefracola was not thirsty, she did not like to refuse the queen, thinking she really meant it kindly. But no sooner had she swallowed the coffee than she seemed to fall into a sort of trance. It seemed to her as if she were Isold again, and that this was her own wedding day. She was dressed in the bridal garments, and the richly embroidered veil was thrown over her. Then, after the wedding ceremony was over, the whole bridal party went for a ride through the forest. It all seemed like a strange dream to the girl. As they passed the blackened ruins of Isolde's tower, Nefracola murmured, "Once thou wert bright and fair, now thou art burnt. O chamber mine!" Fertram bent forward on his horse and asked her what she had said, but she gave him no answer. Shortly after they came to a big lime tree, whose sweet blossoms scented the whole air, and Nefracola murmured, "Behold this giant linden tree, beneath whose shade Fertram and Isold plighted their troth for ever and aye, and he will hold to it yet." After riding some little distance further, they came to the deep trench. Looking down into it, Nefracola murmured, "But for my dear mother's golden gifts, here would my life have ended." Once again Fertram asked her what she had said, but still she remained silent. At last, just as the sun was setting, they returned to the palace. Nefracola dismounted and went up to her own room, but scarcely had she sat down. Then a sudden giddiness seized her, all grew dark before her eyes, and she lost consciousness. Then the queen, who had been waiting for her, came forth from behind a screen where she had been hidden, and, taking off the bridal garments, she hastened with them to dark Isolde's room. The latter had now regained her fair form, and was quickly robed in the rich garments of the bride, after which the queen returned to Nefracola and dressed her in her usual dress. Presently Fertram came for Isolde, and, sitting down beside her, asked her what she had said during the ride, when they passed the ruins of her tower. "I really cannot remember what I said," replied Isolde. "But you must tell me," said Fertram. Then Isolde went to her mother and asked her what Nefracola could have said. So the queen told her, and Isolde returned to Fertram and repeated the words. But he felt strangely dissatisfied. "I should also like to know what it was you said when we passed beneath the great lime tree, and when we came to that deep trench in the forest." "I really cannot recollect all I said," replied dark Isolde crossly. "I am sure it was nothing of any importance." "Nay, but I insist upon knowing," said Fertram. "You seem so strange, and not at all like yourself. You must tell me." So Isolde once again went to her mother, and the queen said that when they came to the great linden tree, Nefracola had said, "Behold the giant linden tree, beneath whose shade Fertram and Isolde plighted their troth for ever and aye, and he will hold to it yet." And that when they arrived at the deep trench, she murmured, "But for my dear mother's golden gifts, here would my life have ended." When dark Isolde returned to Fertram with these answers, she thought, "Surely now he must be satisfied." But all these replies had just the opposite effect, for the more he heard, the more strange and startling did it all appear to him. "Oh, my lost fair Isolde," he cried, "would that I could learn the truth of all this." Then suddenly it seemed as if a veil were lifted from his memory. He recollected all his love for his cousin, fair Isolde, and how different she was in every way to the dark maiden beside him. "Oh, Isolde, my own fair princess," he cried, Would that I could see you once again and hold you to my heart. But as you are dead, and this is not possible, may I also die, and so be with you." Scarcely had these words passed his lips when a soft light suddenly filled the room, and lo! in the open doorway stood his own fair cousin, more sweet and beautiful than ever. Stretching out her arms towards him, she said, "O Fertram, your love and faithfulness have conquered and overcome the wicked spells of my stepmother. If you indeed are still true to me, we may yet defeat her, and all will be well." "Isolde, my own Isolde," cried Fertram, "can it really be you? Or is it only your spirit, and are you not dead, as they solemnly assured me?" And he drew her lovingly towards him. At this moment the queen rushed into the room, speedily followed by the king. When she saw that her wicked scheme had fallen through, she gave a great scream which shook the whole palace. In an instant she was changed back into the wicked giantess she had originally been, and her daughter, who was behind her, became again the ugly little dwarf. The king, in his anger at the terrible deception that had been practiced on him, wanted then and there to order them to be instantly killed. But, at fair Isolde's petition, they were sent back to their own island and bound never to quit it on pain of instant death. Then a fresh and, this time, a very merry wedding feast was ordered, which was much more magnificent than the last one. The tables were laden with peacocks roasted and peacocks spiced, with fishes boiled and fishes fried, with mimjam and pimjam and multum salve. The wine that was drank was primate and claret, as well as the wine of Garganus. Then all the guests, ere their departure, were laden with presents from the king's treasure house. And when, after some years, the old king was gathered to his fathers, Fertram and Isolde reigned jointly, and lived long and happily, seeing their children and great-great-grandchildren around them. Prince. In a far country there once lived a king and a queen. They had an only son, called Hlini, who even as a child showed wonderful talents, and grew up the handsomest, cleverest, and bravest man in all the land. One day the prince went out hunting with some of the courtiers. It was a beautiful morning. The sun shone with unusual brilliancy. Birds and game of all kinds were plentiful, and, well pleased with their good day's sport, the whole party turned homewards as the afternoon shadows began to lengthen, when suddenly a thick fog arose, which soon completely surrounded them. They lost sight of the prince, and it was only with great difficulty that they made their way back to the castle. When the king heard that his son had not returned, he became very anxious, and the fog having somewhat lifted, he at once sent out messengers to try and find him. But although they searched in all directions for 3 days and nights, they could find no trace of him. No one had heard of or seen Prince Hlini. This sudden disappearance of his son greatly grieved the king, and when, on the evening of the 3rd day, the messengers returned without any news of him, the king retired to his room and, throwing himself on his bed, gave way to the deepest grief. In vain the queen tried to cheer him, telling him that Hlini was so brave and clever he would be sure to return safely. The king would not be consoled, and said he would gladly give the half of his kingdom to anyone who would bring him back his son. Now, not far from the palace, in the middle of a wild moor, covered with yellow gorse and purple heather, there lived an old man in a little cottage with his only child, a daughter called Signy, who was both beautiful and clever. They were very poor, but lived happily and contented on wild honey and the berries that grew on the moors. When Signy heard from the shepherds that the prince had disappeared and that the king had offered the half of his kingdom to whoever should find him, she begged her father to let her go in search of him. At first he was very unwilling to part with her, dreading the dangers she might have to encounter. But Signy said she felt quite sure she would succeed in her search. All she wanted was a pair of new shoes and some food. And so, after a little more persuasion, her father gave her his blessing and started her on her journey. Signy wandered on for several days, resting in the evenings in some sheltered nook and ever going towards the north. It was now midsummer. The days were long, in fact. There was scarcely any night. And on the fourth evening, just as the sun, like a huge red ball, was setting in a bed of crimson and gold, only to rise again, Signy saw some rocks in front of her, in one of which was a huge cave. Listening carefully for a few minutes and hearing no sound, Signy entered very softly, and there she saw two beds. One was covered with a beautiful blue silk quilt embroidered with gold. The other had a crimson velvet quilt embroidered with silver. Going cautiously forward, she saw the prince lying fast asleep on the bed with the golden quilt. Signy was delighted with her discovery and went up to him to waken him. But though she shook him, at first gently and then more roughly, she found she could not rouse him. Looking up, she saw some strange letters or runes cut into the wooden headboard of the bed. Now, though her father, who was a learned old man, had taught Signy to read runes, she could make nothing of these. She therefore determined to wait and see who the owner of the cave was, and discovering a narrow recess near the opening, she crept quietly in. Hardly had she got safely into her hiding place than she heard a terrible noise, like a peal of thunder. The earth began to quake, and presently two frightful giantesses entered the cave. As they came in, the taller and elder of the two cried out angrily, "Pah! I smell the smell of a human being here." "Of course you do," replied her sister, "seeing that Hlini the king's son is asleep here." They then went to the bed on which Hlini was lying, and moving the headboard on which the runes were carved to one side, out came two beautiful silver swans. "Sing, my beautiful swans, sing and waken Hlini," cried the giantesses. And as the swans, obeying, sang a lovely sweet song, the prince awoke. The younger giantess then brought him a silver tray laden with delicious fruit and wine, but the prince would not touch anything. "Will you marry me now?" then asked the giantess. "No, no, and again no," cried the prince. "Then sing, sing, my beautiful swans, that Hlini may go to sleep again," she called out angrily. And as the swans raised their voices in a sad, plaintive melody, the prince fell back on the bed, and was soon in his magic sleep again. The two sisters then lay down on the other couch with the silver-embroidered quilt. In the morning they again wakened Hlini in the same manner, and offered him food, which, however, he angrily refused, whereupon the younger giantess again asked him if he would marry her. And when he refused, as before, the sisters put him to sleep by the song of the swans, and then left the cave, closing it as they went out. After waiting a little while to make sure that the wicked sisters were not coming back again, Signy came out of her hiding place, and moving the headboard of the bed. As she had seen the sisters do, she called to the swans, and as they sang their song, the prince awoke. He was greatly surprised to see Signy in place of the hideous giant sisters, and thanked her warmly for her help, asking how she had come there. Then Signy told him how much his father sorrowed at his mysterious disappearance, and that she had determined to try and find him. Hlini was very grateful, and told Signy that, after he had got separated from his friends in the fog, he had suddenly encountered the giant sisters, who, having their swans with them, put him to sleep before he had time to fight them or get away, and that they had then forcibly carried him off to their cave, and that the younger sister, as she had no doubt heard, wanted to marry him. But this he had steadily refused to do. As long as he remained firm, they could only keep him there asleep, but, he added, he would rather remain thus for ever than marry the ogress. When he had finished his tale, Signy said, "Now the first thing we must do is to find out the meaning of the runes on the headboard. When, therefore, the sisters come in this evening, do not refuse their food, for you will want all your strength to get away, but be friendly with them, and then ask them what the letters mean, and also what they do all day while they are away." Hlini said he would certainly follow Signy's advice. Then, finding a chessboard and some men on a shelf, they sat down and amused themselves playing and chatting till they thought it was drawing near the time when the giantesses usually returned. Then Signy called the swans and put the prince to sleep, as she had seen the sisters do, after which she hid herself in her dark corner. Soon she heard the sisters returning, and presently they entered the cave. "I certainly do smell the smell of a human being," said the elder sister, sniffing angrily round the cave. "Nonsense," replied the younger one, who, having lit the fire, was anxious to get their supper cooked. "Of course you smell it when Hlini is here." "But this is a different smell," persisted the elder sister, and Signy, seeing her peering about, feared she would discover her. But the younger sister, having plucked and cleaned the birds they had caught, told her elder sister she must cook them at once, as she was about to waken Hlini, and, going up to the couch with the gold-embroidered quilt, on which Hlini was lying asleep, she called forth the swans and wakened him. By this time the birds were cooked, and when she asked him if he would take any food, instead of refusing, Hlini said he felt hungry and would join them at their supper. The younger giantess was greatly pleased, and after helping him to fruit and wine, asked him whether he would not now make her his wife. But Hlini said he must first know more about her and her sister before he could decide. "What, for instance, is the meaning of those runes carved on the bedhead?" he asked. "Oh," replied the giantess graciously, "the words are 'Fly, fly, O bedstead mine, and carry me whither I will.' You have only to sit down on the bed and repeat those words, and immediately you are carried to whatever place you wish to go." The prince was delighted when he heard this, as he hoped it would enable him and Signy to escape. "And what do you and your sister do all day when you are out?" he asked. "Well, we roam about, looking for some man, woman, or child for our dinner, for we always prefer them to birds or animals, and then, when we get tired, we sit down under a tree and play with our life egg," replied the giantess. "I suppose you have to be very careful when you are playing with your life egg?" asked the prince. "Yes, indeed we have to be," answered the giantess, "for if it were broken, we should both die. But there is no fear of that." And she gave a loud laugh. "We are much too careful. It can only be broken by a human being, and whenever one of them comes near us, we soon catch him and eat him." The prince now declared that he felt so tired he really must go to sleep, and though, before calling the swans, the giantess again asked him to marry her, he said he could say nothing till the morning, so he was put to sleep as before. The next morning, after the sisters had wakened him and given him some food, they asked him if he would go to the woods with them. But Hlini said he still felt very tired and would prefer to rest. So the sisters put him to sleep again and went away, closing the cave after them. Waiting a short time, so as to make quite sure that the giantesses would not return, Signy presently came forth from her hiding place and awakened the prince. "Get up quickly," she said, "for we will follow the giantesses into the wood. Take with you your hunting spear, which stands beside the bed, and when they begin to play at throw and catch with their life ball, you must throw your spear at the egg, but keep a clear eye and a firm hand, for remember, if you miss, both your life and mine will be forfeited." "Never fear," said Hlini. "There is too much at stake. I will be careful." Then they seated themselves on the couch, and both repeated the rune, "Fly, fly, O bedstead mine, and carry me whither I will." And immediately the bed rose up, the wall of the cave opened, and passing swiftly through the air, it landed them amid the leafy branches of a huge oak tree. Peeping cautiously down, they saw the two giantesses sitting at the foot of the tree. One was holding the golden life egg in her hand, ready to throw it at her sister, and both were laughing loudly as the egg flew backwards and forwards between them. Watching his opportunity, Hlini threw his spear just as one sister was poising it in her hand, and as the point of the spear hit the egg, it broke in half. At the same instant, both giantesses fell back dead. A stream of dark-colored poison poured from their lips, and huge, deadly black and yellow fungi sprang up and speedily covered them completely. Hlini then seated himself beside Signy on the couch, and immediately they were carried back to the cave. Here they found, on searching round, an immense quantity of gold, silver, and jewels, and having laden both beds with these and the two silver swans, they each sat down on one, and, repeating the runes, were speedily transported to the hut of Signy's father, who was delighted at his daughter's safe return, and made Hlini very welcome. The next morning Signy went to the king's palace and demanded an audience, and the king, having admitted her, asked her who she was and what she wanted. "I am the daughter of the old man who lives in the little hut on the moor near your palace," replied Signy, "and I have come to ask what reward you would give me if I bring your son back to you safe and well." The king laughed good-naturedly. "I do not think I need trouble to answer that," he said. "There is not much chance of your finding him when so many others have failed." "But if I succeed," persisted Signy, "will you give me the same reward as you have promised to others?" "Certainly," replied the king. "If you succeed in bringing back my son safe and well, I will not go back from my word." Then Signy returned to the hut and begged the prince to return with her to the palace, and together they entered the great audience hall. When the king beheld his son, whom he had mourned as dead, alive and well, he was greatly rejoiced, and made him sit down on his right hand and relate the story of all that had happened to him since the day he became separated from his friends during the chase. When Hlini seated himself beside the king, he begged Signy to take the seat on his other hand, and then began the relation of all his adventures, telling of his imprisonment in the cave, and how Signy had freed him and saved his life by rescuing him from the hands of the wicked giantesses. When he had finished, he rose from his seat, and standing before his father, asked his permission to take Signy as his wife. To this the king willingly assented, saying that no reward could be too great for her, who had restored his son to him. So orders were at once issued for the preparation of a magnificent wedding feast. All the great nobles of the kingdom were invited, neither were the poor forgotten. There was ample provision made for all, and everyone praised the king for his right royal hospitality, for each one received rich gifts ere they returned home. Signy's father was made the king's librarian, and put in charge of the royal manuscripts, and Hlini and Signy lived long and happily together, surrounded by their children and grandchildren. Fertram and Hildur long, long ago, in a distant land, there lived a king and queen who were quite happy, save for one thing: they had no children. Some years passed, and then, to their great joy, a little baby girl arrived who was named Hildur. When the christening feast came to an end, the king, who was devoted to hunting, set out with his courtiers for a long day in the great forest which surrounded the castle. Nothing unusual happened until the hunting party began to turn homewards. The king was riding alone, a little in front of his gaily dressed retinue, when he suddenly saw an enormous dragon flying swiftly through the air towards him, holding a small child in his talons. In an instant the king drew his bow. The arrow, shot by his practised hand, sped to its mark, and the monster fell to the ground, pierced through the heart. The king leapt from his horse, and by the time his courtiers reached his side, he was holding in his arms the rescued child, a beautiful boy of about a year old, quite unhurt. There were plenty of willing arms ready to carry the little fellow, but the king refused. "I rescued him, and now he shall be a playmate for my little daughter," he said. And the whole party went back to the castle. Years passed on. The children grew up together and loved each other dearly. The king and queen had named the little boy Fertram, and they treated him in all respects like their own child. If one of the little ones had a present, the other had the same, and at last they were never happy if they parted even for a day. Now, Hildur's grandmother was deeply versed in all kinds of magic arts, and even when the young princess was still quite a girl, she taught her many of her secrets. The child was the one being whom she loved. On the other hand, she had an unreasoning dislike to the boy who had so strangely become part of the family, and when she saw the affection of the young people for one another, she determined to poison Fertram. "Never shall my beloved grandchild wed this foundling boy," she said to herself. "The son of one of our rich neighbours is the mate I destine for her." So she waited for an opportunity. One day, Fertram came in very hungry from a long day's hunting. The grandmother caused a dainty dish to be set before him and begged him to partake of it. But Hildur, who had noticed her grandmother's dislike to the young prince, came in at the moment and, seeing the dish was poisoned, prevented his eating it. Another time the grandmother attempted to kill him as he lay asleep in his bed, but Hildur again divined her intentions. She warned Fertram, and they placed a log of wood in the bed. When night came, the old woman entered, and with a dagger pierced the figure in the bed, as she thought. But, to her surprise, the weapon remained firmly fixed in the log, whilst her hands were fastened to the handle, and she had to remain thus until morning broke, when the spell gave way. Twice had Hildur thus been able to save Fertram, but they both saw that he was no longer safe. At any moment, the old woman might exercise some magic art, and prevent Hildur saving him again. They decided that they must take some other course. One morning early, before even the sleepy guards at the gate were awake, the young princess and Fertram passed through, and turned their steps towards the unknown world lying beyond their own grounds. At first they wandered through fields and found the way easy. "It was the only way, Fertram," said Hildur. When the young man regretted leaving without a word of thanks or love to those who had cared for him through the long years since his childhood, "it was the only way. Nowhere in my father's castle would you have been safe, and my grandmother would only have vented her anger upon my parents if they had known of our flight." At length a small river stopped their way. In an instant Hildur changed herself and Fertram into trout, and, glittering in the sunlight, they leaped into the water. Hardly had they got below the surface when they saw the grandmother walking along the bank of the river. She had tracked them at once, and now used her spells to try and catch them in their present form. The day wore on, but her art was useless. Nothing would entrap the wary trout, and at last, filled with rage, she retraced her steps to the castle. It was sunset now, and the two young people, having resumed their natural shape, pursued their way into the forest. "We must no longer take the form of fish," Hildur said. "Even now grandmother will be weaving a magic net, out of which no fish can possibly escape." And up in her tower, the grandmother went on weaving. At first the work went smoothly, but soon the netting became entangled, the knots no longer held together, and her spell showed her that the fugitives were no longer fish, but had resumed their own forms. "Go forth immediately," she said to her servants. Take everyone who can be spared. Search all through the forest and kill every living thing that you see." So the servants searched all day in every direction, but not a creature was to be seen. At last, as night drew on, they met two beautiful dogs. They were the most magnificent animals they had ever seen. But although they were quite friendly with the servants, they did not allow themselves to be touched. The men therefore returned to the castle and told what had happened. The wrath of the grandmother was terrible to see. She knew at once that the dogs were Fertram and Hildur, and she commanded the servants to be thrown into the dungeons for not carrying out her orders. Hildur, by her magic power, knew what had taken place. "We must not stay here, Fertram," she said sadly. "My grandmother will never rest now until she kills us. Even her love for me seems to have turned to hatred." "But what can we do?" Fertram asked. "Better let me go by myself out into the world, and do you return. Then all will be well." But Hildur made no answer. Presently she unfolded a square of green cloth. "Sit on this beside me," she said. In a moment they were floating high up in the air. The day wore on. Sometimes they were borne along swiftly by a strong breeze. Then a soft, gentle wind would come and seem almost to rock them to sleep, till just as the sun was setting, and the sky was one blaze of gold and crimson, Hildur made the cloth descend slowly to the earth again, and they found themselves in a great flowery plain. Magnificent trees shaded it here and there. A beautiful river wound its way gently through luxuriant banks covered with ferns, and in the distance rose the tower of a great city, surmounted by a magnificent castle, standing out distinctly against the sky. "Fertram," Hildur said in a low voice, laying her hand on his arm, "this is your native land. You are the son of the king who once reigned here. Now he has been dead for some years. When you were only a year old, your mother carried you into the beautiful orchard which lies at the foot of the castle, when suddenly a great dragon swooped down, tore you from her arms, and she saw you no more. Your father grieved even more for you than your mother. You were his only child, and the loss preyed upon him, till at length he died of grief. The kingdom will soon have no ruler, for your mother, who hid her grief for your father's sake, is now pining away, and they fear for her life too. Now, Fertram, you must go to her, tell her your history, and receive the kingdom from her hands." "Hildur, dear Hildur, can it be true? Have I really a mother of my own, as you have? It is almost too delightful to believe." "Come, let us hasten to her," cried Fertram. "No," Hildur answered, "I must not go with you. You must go alone. But I will remain quietly in that small hut which is under the great tree yonder, until you come for me. But, oh, Fertram," and she clasped his arm with her two white hands, "remember, I am alone in a strange country. Do not forget me." "Forget you? When you have been everything to me all these years? Hildur, how could I? Such a thing could never happen. I love you better than myself." "Yes, I know," Hildur answered, "but I fear some evil. I know not what." Then, to prevent her grandmother's spells taking effect, she rubbed some salve out of a small box she carried over his hands and face, and bade him a sorrowful farewell. Fertram embraced her tenderly, laughed away her fears, and then took his way towards the town. He looked very handsome, as he turned once more to wave his cap to her, and the sun's rays lit up his fair hair. She watched him till she could see him no longer, and then went on to the little hut she had destined for her temporary abode. Fertram only stopped once on his way to the city. Feeling tired with the long journey, he sat down under an oak tree on a grassy mound. While he was resting, a beautiful dog came up, and as he patted and stroked it, the dog licked his face and hands. Immediately, Fertram forgot all his past life, and that Hildur was waiting for him in the hut under the trees. Having rested, he rose up and pursued his way into the town. "Can I see the queen?" he inquired. "I have news for her which will give her joy." At first no one paid any heed, but the youth's noble appearance struck the courtiers, and at length he was admitted into the palace. There he was brought before the queen, who was lying pale and languid on a great couch of rich silks and cloth of gold. When he bowed before her, she rose to a sitting position, startled out of her apathy and weakness by his likeness to the dead king. "Who is this youth? Where does he come from?" she asked. "Madam," the courtiers answered, "he is a stranger who craves admittance as a bearer of good tidings to your majesty." Then, in a few words, Fertram told his tale. Before it was done, he was clasped in the loving arms of his mother, who felt it was indeed her long-lost son. The court was summoned together to hear the glad tidings. The news was proclaimed in the streets of the city. The queen gave the government at once into the hands of her son, and the young king was crowned amid universal rejoicings. Day after day went by. Fertram was absorbed with the affairs of his kingdom and his love for his mother. All thought of Hildur had gone like a dream. One day the city was roused to great excitement by the appearance of a most beautiful maiden. No one knew whence she had come, but all agreed that her loveliness could not be surpassed, and when the queen saw her, she sent for her to the palace, treated her like a daughter, and besought Fertram to marry her. This, however, he steadily refused to do. After a time, whispers went abroad that the beautiful girl was not as good as she was lovely. Her fair face was constantly disfigured by an ugly frown if things were not arranged as she liked, and the courtiers began to think that the king was right, after all, in preferring to seek another wife. Just then, one of the royal swineherds happened to lose his way in the forest, and he wandered on until he came to a little hut. There he found an old man and his wife, and with them a fair maiden whom they called their daughter. Never had the swineherd seen anyone so beautiful, and he determined to stay the night with these people and, if possible, carry off the maiden. He found that her name was Hildur, and when the old people had gone up to bed, while Hildur was closing the windows and putting things straight before following their example, he suggested that they should go out and look at the beautiful moon rising. But Hildur said, "I must first make up the fire on the hearth." The man offered to do it for her, but no sooner had he knelt down than his hands became fastened to the hearth. In vain he struggled to get away. It was all of no avail. Hildur was nowhere to be seen, and it was not until morning that he felt free once more. Then, rising to his feet, he fled from the uncanny place without once looking back. When he reached the castle, his fellow servants soon heard the whole tale, and the report of the beauty of the woodcutter's daughter was circulated from one to the other. The royal huntsman thought he, too, would like to see her. So, setting off at once, he reached the hut and begged for a night's rest. The old people granted it willingly. The beautiful girl was still there, and the huntsman in his turn planned to carry her off that night. He begged Hildur to come for a walk, as it was such a beautiful night. But she refused. "My time is too fully occupied for idle wanderings," she said. "Will you help me by locking up the door for the night?" "Willingly," said the huntsman, intending to put the key in his pocket and carry her off later on. But no sooner had his hands touched the lock than they remained fastened to it. A mocking laugh behind him made him look round, and he saw Hildur disappearing up the stairs to her room. When the sun was well up in the sky, and the old couple beginning to stir, the huntsman found he could remove his hands, and he hurried off shamefaced to his home. Shortly after this, the king was out hunting in the forest, when suddenly a thick black fog enveloped everything. He lost his way completely and became separated from his people. At length, after some hours, he arrived at a little hut, knocked joyfully at the door, and on its being opened by an old man, craved leave to rest. He was at once invited to enter, and then the old man, recognizing the king, begged him to excuse the poverty of the place. The king sat down, wearied with his long wandering, and the old man waited upon him, bringing food and drink of the best he had. Just as the meal was ended, Hildur came in, and the king thought he had never seen anyone so beautiful before. She was dressed as a simple peasant, but she looked like a royal princess. The king begged leave to stay the night, as it was still too foggy for him to find his way, and the old man acceded, only apologizing for the poorness of the accommodation. "I will not disturb you," the king said. "Let me only rest in this room for the night, as I have been doing now." So it was arranged. After the old couple had gone to bed, the king begged Hildur to stay and talk with him, but she said she must see to the calves in the stable. "That I can do for you," he answered, and, rising, he went out into the stable, put the straw and hay right for the calves, and had made everything tidy when one of them got out. After great trouble, he caught hold of it by the tail, but, alas, his hands remained fastened to it, and he was found in this plight by Hildur just before dawn. She laughed merrily when she saw him. "It hardly suits a king, my lord," she said, "to be hanging on to the tail of a calf." But Fertram humbly begged her to release him. As she did so, she looked up at him. "Do you not recognize me?" she said. "No," replied Fertram, much astonished. "I have never seen you before, I am certain." "Perhaps, then, I remind you of someone?" she asked again. "Of Hildur, the king's daughter, who brought you back to your kingdom." "No," he said again, more puzzled still. "I never even remember hearing the name of Hildur." Then Hildur went and fetched the little box of ointment, and directly she rubbed it on his hands and face, his past life came back to him. He embraced Hildur again and again, thanking her for all she had done for him, and asking her to forgive his apparent coldness and forgetfulness. "You, and you alone, have had my love all this time at any rate," he said, "for I could love no one else, and you alone shall be my queen." Sitting down together in the early morning sunshine under one of the great forest trees, Hildur told him what he did not know, namely, that the beautiful girl whom his mother had taken into the palace was really her old grandmother. She had followed them and transformed herself so that Fertram should marry her. Then she meant to kill him and his mother and seize the kingdom. "So far I have guarded you from her wicked schemes," Hildur said, laying her hand on his. "But, knowing that the past was no longer in your mind, I have feared each day that she might succeed in winning you. For had you been unfaithful to me, I could no longer have done anything for you against her wiles." Again and again Fertram thanked her. Then he bade her a tender farewell, and went straight back to the city. The great council of the kingdom was summoned, and to them the young king disclosed the real history of the wicked grandmother. But she was too cunning to be caught and punished. Divining what had happened, she disappeared amid a cloud of fire and smoke. Then Fertram, accompanied by a magnificent retinue with glittering dresses, splendid horses, and all the nobles of the kingdom, went to fetch his bride. She was still in her simple peasant's dress, but her beauty made all forget what she wore. Mounting the beautiful steed brought for her, she rode back beside Fertram to the palace, and on the steps, waiting to receive her, was Fertram's mother. This was indeed a joyful day for her. The wish of her heart was granted in the loveliness and goodness of her son's bride. The wedding was celebrated with the utmost pomp and magnificence, and Fertram and Hildur lived happily together surrounded as years passed on by their beautiful children and grandchildren. The end.